February 24, 1981, Buckingham Palace. A 19-year-old kindergarten assistant sits beside a 32-year-old prince under hot television lights, smiling for the cameras of a planet that has decided she ranks as its new favorite character. The interviewer asks the obvious question, "Are they in love?" She nods immediately without hesitation. Then the future King of England, the man she will marry in 5 months, leans toward the microphone and adds 5 words that will haunt the British monarchy for the next 4 decades. Whatever in love means. Inside the studio, the room kept moving, the cameras kept rolling. Nobody understood that a marriage had just been autopsied on live television before it had even started. Diana later told Andrew Morton that this single sentence threw her completely, that she heard it as a verdict rather than a philosophical aside. She had turned 19 barely 7 months earlier, raised on Barbara Cartland romance novels written by her own step-grandmother, walking into a wedding that 750 million people would eventually watch on TV. Across from her sat a man who had just answered the most basic question in romance with what sounded like a footnote from a Cambridge seminar. That sentence forms where most documentaries about this marriage begin and end. To understand why those 5 words felt so devastating, why they functioned less as a slip and more as a diagnosis, you have to rewind. Way back, past the cathedral, past the proposal, past the long string of supervised meetings in country houses, back to a letter written in 1974 by a man who would die before Diana Spencer ever met her future husband. This marriage did not collapse because 2 people drifted apart inside it. It collapsed before either of them spoke a single word at the altar, because every structural condition that enabled the wedding had also doomed it. Let's start with the man who designed the marriage without ever attending it. His name was Lord Louis Mountbatten, and the design work happened years before the bride had emerged as an option. Mountbatten ranked as Prince Charles's great-uncle, his self-appointed mentor, and arguably the most influential courtier in his life. He loved playing kingmaker. He had already engineered the match between his own nephew, Prince Philip, and the future Queen Elizabeth II, and he intended to repeat the favour for the next generation. In February 1974, when Charles turned 25 and floundered through the Royal Navy, Mountbatten wrote him a letter that reads, "In retrospect, like the instruction manual for a disaster." The advice came down to a 2-track formula. Sow the wild oats now. Find a suitable, attractive, sweet-charactered girl later. Ideally one young enough that she had not yet met anyone else she might fall for. Mountbatten did not intend cruelty. He genuinely believed this counted as kind advice for a future monarch in a fishbowl. Back in 1974, the idea that a prince should carry a romantic past while his wife should arrive at the altar untouched by the world did not even count as controversial inside the palace. It functioned as policy disguised as wisdom. Charles took the advice seriously. So seriously that historians like Sally Bedell Smith now describe the late Mountbatten as the ghost in the room during every subsequent courtship decision Charles ever reached. Then, in August 1979, the IRA murdered Mountbatten with a bomb planted on his fishing boat off the coast of County Sligo. Charles broke down in a way that those closest to him had never witnessed before. Mountbatten had functioned as a father figure, a confidant, and the only adult in his life who would actually tell him what to do. With Mountbatten dead, Charles inherited an unfinished assignment from a man he could no longer disappoint or disobey. At 30, single and still grieving, Charles held a checklist written by a corpse. That checklist contained 3 non-negotiable requirements. Mountbatten had not invented them personally. The constitutional plumbing of the British monarchy dictated each one. The bride had to be Protestant, because the Act of Settlement of 1701 still excluded any heir who married a Catholic from the throne. Aristocratic stock came next, an unwritten convention going back centuries. Most punishingly, she had to arrive as a virgin, because the tabloid press of 1980 had transformed every prior girlfriend into a kiss-and-tell liability. Now ask yourself a simple question. How many women in their 20s, in late 1970s, Britain raised inside aristocratic society with full Protestant credentials would satisfy that third condition while also surfacing publicly enough for Charles to even meet them? The answer shrank to a vanishingly small pool. Statistically speaking, Diana Spencer represented almost the only eligible candidate left in the country, which meant the marriage did not begin as a love story so much as a demographic accident wearing a wedding dress. While Mountbatten's ghost hovered over the formal criteria, two living women inside the palace actively pushed the actual match. The first was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, came second, serving as Diana's maternal grandmother and as a long-serving lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother herself, which placed both women at the centre of the same social orbit for years. These two had remained close friends for decades. They moved in the same Norfolk circles, attended the same musical events, and shared the same conviction that Diana, the youngest Spencer girl, would suit the heir to the throne perfectly. No transcript of their conversations survives because polite English women of that generation did not write things down. The trail of arranged weekends, carefully timed Sandringham invitations, and the encouragement Diana received from Lady Fermoy during the courtship all point to a quiet but determined campaign. Lady Fermoy carried previous history here. Back in 1969, when Diana's parents divorced, she testified in court against her own daughter, Frances Shand Kidd, which helped Diana's father win full custody of the children. That does not count as a normal grandmother decision. It counts as a woman so committed to traditional aristocratic order that she would publicly betray her own daughter to preserve the Spencer line. The same woman would now encourage her granddaughter to marry the most scrutinized man in the Commonwealth. According to multiple biographers, Lady Fermoy carried regrets to her grave. Before her death in 1993, she reportedly apologized to Diana for the role she had played in arranging the match. The apology arrived 12 years too late. By then, the wedding had happened, the children had been born, the affairs had become public, and Diana had grown into a woman so famous her face moved global stock prices when she walked into a room. Something genuinely sad lingers in the image of an old woman realizing on her deathbed that the wedding she helped engineer destroyed her granddaughter's life. The dark comedy of how late that realization arrived only deepens the picture, given that almost every neutral observer at the time of the engagement had voiced quiet concerns. The grandmothers picked Diana for docility, youth, and inexperience. Those same qualities became the wedge that the palace eventually drove into her psyche. The easy version of the story casts Camilla Parker Bowles as the villain who broke up a fairy tale. The harder version paints her as something more complicated. She functioned as the obstacle that nobody removed before the wedding because nobody, including Charles himself, actually wanted her removed from the picture in any meaningful way. Charles and Camilla met in 1971 at a polo match. Their connection clicked immediately. They shared the same age, the same circles, and the same slightly arch upper-class sense of humor. By every account that has surfaced since, the relationship represented the closest emotional bond Charles had ever formed with any woman, and it possibly remained so for the rest of his life. The reason they did not marry then forms its own study in royal dysfunction. Charles deployed with the Royal Navy in 1973, and while he sailed at sea, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. The dominant rumour, never confirmed, holds that the Queen Mother and palace advisors quietly discouraged a Charles-Camilla match because Camilla carried a romantic past with Andrew, which counted as disqualifying for a future queen. So Charles lost her, or thought he did. Penny Junor and Sally Bedell Smith, both of whom have spent careers reconstructing this timeline, conclude that the physical affair between Charles and Camilla resumed in late 1978 or early 1979. By the time Charles started seriously considering Diana, he had already entered an emotionally committed extramarital relationship with a married woman. That formed the dating market into which a teenage Diana Spencer arrived. She did not compete with a memory, she competed with a living person who already knew Charles's daily schedule better than he did. Camilla even entered the courtship logistics. In autumn 1980, Diana visited the Parker Bowles country house at Bolehide Manor. The mythology around this visit, mostly generated by pro-Diana sources later, frames it as a vetting exercise where Camilla approved or rejected Diana as a suitable bride for the man Camilla actually wanted to keep sleeping with. A colder analysis from biographers like Tina Brown holds that Camilla simply did not perceive the 19-year-old as a threat. Why would she? Diana could become the wife, while Camilla remained everything else. In Camilla's reading of the situation, the arrangement would hold precisely because Diana ranked as too young, too unworldly, and too eager to please to cause any trouble. That calculation underestimated exactly one variable. Diana, the kindergarten assistant in the Laura Ashley skirts, turned out to possess one of the sharpest emotional radars in the Western world, and the bracelet she would soon discover in Michael Colborne's office would teach Camilla that lesson the hard way. Here lives a statistic that sounds invented, but apparently is not. According to the recordings Diana made for Andrew Morton in 1991, she and Charles met only 13 times before he proposed. 13 meetings, scattered across country house weekends and polo afternoons, formed the entire foundation of a marriage that would last 15 years on paper. Royal historians have spent decades trying to verify or debunk that number. Nobody can produce a definitive logbook of every encounter, but the rough order of magnitude remains uncontested. The couple met in group settings during Cows Week in summer 1980. Balmoral, that August saw them together again, where Diana's apparent love of the outdoors charmed the older royals. Sandringham followed. Polo matches, parties, country house gatherings filled out the rest of the tally. Almost never alone, almost never in any context that would let either of them actually develop a private relationship. This pattern did not count as unusual for royal courtships of the era. It functioned as the system working as designed. The trouble lay in the fact that the system had been designed before television, before paparazzi, before the post-war collapse of arranged aristocratic marriages, and before British women routinely expected their husbands to also function as their friends. Charles operated from a script written for his great-grandfather. When Charles finally proposed in February 1981, his own description of his emotional state landed, by his own admission, somewhere between confused and resigned. In letters to friends, including Nicholas Soames, he described himself as anxious, uncertain, and hoping that affection would grow once the wedding had taken place. None of this describes a man in love. It describes a man complying with an instruction passed down from his elders. Diana, meanwhile, accepted instantly. She would later describe the moment as feeling like she had completed a mission, almost like the state itself had selected her for a national role she had been auditioning for since childhood. In that moment, she perceived correctly. The role existed, and the marriage attached to it functioned only as the prop. In late January or early February 1981, Prince Philip wrote a letter to his son. The contents of that letter remain one of the most debated documents in modern royal history. That single argument has shaped every subsequent debate about who counted as the real victim of the eventual divorce and which party deserves the historical sympathy of the British public decades after the fact. Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of Charles, published in 1994, framed Philip's letter as essentially an ultimatum. The framing was bold. According to that telling, Philip told Charles that the press intrusion on Diana had become unsustainable, that the prince either had to propose to her now or step away publicly and let her rebuild her reputation. Charles, in the Dimbleby version, read this as a command from his father and proposed against his own emotional judgment. That version remains contested. Philip himself, before his death in 2021, vehemently denied that the letter had been any kind of ultimatum. Hugo Vickers and Sally Bedell Smith, working from later interviews with friends of Philip and members of the household, argue that the letter offered pragmatic advice rather than a command. They suggest Philip simply laid out the binary choice in a tone he believed counted as helpful, and that Charles, paralyzed by indecision and still grieving Mountbatten, misread blunt parenting as a royal directive. The honest answer probably sits between the two. Philip earned a reputation for directness, sometimes brutally so, and the line between fatherly advice and fatherly command always thinned inside that household. Charles had spent 30 years deferring to older men, and he interpreted Philip's letter the same way he had interpreted Mountbatten's letters before it, as something to obey. Whether Philip actually intended that interpretation almost falls beside the point. Charles believed himself to have been pushed, and he carried that belief into the marriage like a slow poison. The 5 months between the engagement and the wedding became the period when the marriage actually died. Both parties knew it, yet neither could find the language to admit out loud what was unfolding inside the gilded corridors of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace in the spring of 1981. Diana moved into Clarence House and then Buckingham Palace, separated from the friends she had been living with at her Coleherne Court flat in Earl's Court. The palace provided no real guidance, no training, no mentor. Royal courtiers, conditioned to serve the existing senior royals, treated her as a temporary nuisance. Michael Colborne, Charles's private secretary, later described an incident in which Diana kicked his furniture and wept in his office, frustrated by being ignored on questions about her own diary. She had just turned 19, had just moved out of a flat with her girlfriends and into one of the most psychologically isolating institutions in Europe, and nobody had thought to assign her a guide. The eating disorder that would define her public health for the next decade exploded during this engagement period. Diana had shown anorexic tendencies as a teenager at Westheath. Her full descent into bulimia, by her own account on the Morton tapes, began in February 1981, weeks after she moved into Clarence House and started to feel her old life close behind her like a heavy door. The specific trigger she identified came from an offhand comment by Charles. He had put his hand on her waist, allegedly, and remarked, "Oh, a bit chubby here, aren't we?" Whether that line landed as a joke or a serious observation, it struck a 19-year-old already drowning in tabloid scrutiny and the unresolved family abandonment trauma of her parents' bitter 1969 divorce. The bulimia took hold within weeks. Diana lost so much weight before the wedding that the Emmanuel-designed gown required repeated alterations. Her flatmate, Caroline Bartholomew, expressed alarm. Her own sister noticed. Nobody at the palace seems to have noticed at all, or if they did, they chose not to intervene with any of the help she so desperately needed. Then came the bracelet. A few weeks before the wedding, Diana stumbled across a small package in Michael Colborne's office. The package contained a gold chain bracelet, the disc enameled in blue and engraved with two entwined letters, G and F, which Diana read instantly as Gladys and Fred. The private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other in their letters. Charles allegedly told staff and friends afterward that the initials stood for Girl Friday, which would have rendered the piece a perfectly innocent gift to a longtime friend, and maybe that even held true, none of which mattered. Diana had heard the nicknames before. Knew her fiancé planned to deliver a piece of jewelry to another woman days before their wedding, and whatever residual hope she carried at that moment evaporated. In the version Diana told Andrew Morton a decade later, she lunched with her sisters days before the wedding and told them she wanted to call it off. Her sisters reportedly answered with a line so blunt it has become folklore. "Bad luck, Dutch. Your face is on the tea towels, so you're too late to chicken out." The sisters have never publicly confirmed this exchange. The dish towels, however, exist on the historical record alongside the bulimia, the bracelet, the engagement interview, and a bride who had already starved herself for weeks before the cathedral even received its decorations. Picture a man who reads Carl Jung for fun, who corresponds with Lawrence van der Post about mysticism, who farms organic vegetables at his country estate and listens to chamber music in the evenings. Now picture his opposite, a woman who loves pop music, ballet, romantic novels, and London nightlife, who would rather watch an episode of Dynasty than read a single paragraph of philosophy. Now marry them. That arrangement walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in July 1981 with one of the largest television audiences in human history, watching from sofas and pub stools across the planet. The temperamental gulf between Charles and Diana sometimes ends up treated as an afterthought in this story, an addendum to the Camilla problem. It actually formed the foundation. Even without Camilla, this marriage could not have worked. Charles had spent his 32 years sliding into introversion, carefully constructing a rural intellectual life around Highgrove House in Gloucestershire. By contrast, Diana approached the wedding as a 19-year-old extrovert whose idea of happiness involved her flatmates, central London, and a soundtrack of Duran Duran. Their social circles did not overlap and never would. Charles's friends came older, more established, deeply aristocratic. The Van Cutsums, the Palmer Tompkinsons, Nicholas Soames. As a group, they counted as country house Tories who hunted, drank, and laughed at the same kind of slightly arch jokes that the Spencer girl could not quite pass. Diana found them suffocating. The feeling ran mutual by their own private admissions. They found her immature. Neither side ranked as entirely wrong. The two of them simply formed incompatible audiences who could not translate each other's jokes, references, or daily rituals into anything either side actually understood. That household quickly split in two. Charles preferred Highgrove, while Diana wanted Kensington Palace right in the middle of London. Within a year of the wedding, the marriage took on a geographic shape. Charles in the country, Diana in town, the two of them shuttling between residences and occasionally crossing paths inside the same building. Critics sometimes blamed the arrangement on the affair. Geography reveals it as more fundamental. Even without Camilla, Charles and Diana would have functioned as a country mouse and a city mouse, forced to share a single mortgage. People sometimes forget that this division had remained visible to anyone who looked during the courtship period. Charles took Diana to Highgrove, and she hated it. The chamber music sessions ended with her eyes glazing over within minutes, and the conversations about Jungian psychology went nowhere whenever he started one. None of this remained a secret. The palace simply chose to treat it as the kind of friction that would smooth itself out once the wedding had happened and the couple had settled into shared royal duty. Marriage, as it turns out, does not smooth out incompatibility. It magnifies it under stadium lighting. Diana arrived at the wedding already broken. The cracks ran back 12 years, deep into her childhood, into a divorce nobody in either family had managed to handle without lasting damage to the people involved. Charles had no equipment to repair any of it. Her parents had divorced in 1969, when Diana turned 7, in one of the more procedurally unusual custody cases of the era. Diana's father won full custody of the children in a brutal, highly public legal battle that played out in the press as much as in the courtroom. Diana watched her mother leave the family home in a packed car. She remembered the crunch of gravel under the wheels for the rest of her life. Children of acrimonious divorces, particularly children whose mothers leave under what feels to them like abandonment, tend to develop very specific emotional patterns. They require constant reassurance. Object permanence in adult relationships often eludes them. Intense attachments form, then get tested compulsively to see if the other person will leave. None of this entered the palace's understanding in 1981. Family therapy barely counted as a recognized profession in upper-class Britain. The kind of emotional labor Diana would require as an adult sat completely outside the operating manual of her future husband. Diana's home life only deteriorated further when her father remarried Reine, Countess of Dartmouth, in 1976. Reine arrived as a force of nature, ambitious, sharp, elbowed, and committed to renovating both the Spencer estate at Althorpe and the Spencer family hierarchy itself. The siblings nicknamed their stepmother Acid Reine, the kind of cruel pun teenagers invent when they want to defang an authority figure they cannot remove. Althorpe, under Reine's regime, became unbearable. Her mother's house in Scotland offered no obvious refuge either. Caught between two homes that no longer felt like home, the teenage Diana dreamed up a fairy tale escape: a husband, a household, a family of her own. Then the heir to the throne started showing up at her sister's parties. People sometimes miss this part of the Diana story. She did not arrive as a passive victim of palace pressure. The teenager wanted this marriage, wanted it desperately, believed it would solve a problem that had been hurting her since the year her mother walked out. The disaster does not lie in the fact that Diana ended up forced into the wedding. It lies in the fact that she chose the wedding herself, with all her wounded teenage clarity, and the institution she married into proved incapable of holding any of those wounds. Diana coined a phrase for the palace courtiers who managed her life after the engagement. She labelled them the men in grey suits. The term carried mockery and fear in equal measure, and it landed startlingly close to accurate, capturing both their uniform and the institutional indifference they wore like a second one. The royal household in 1981 ran on a model designed for a different century. Senior courtiers, private secretaries, press officers, equerries, all of them served the monarch and the heir. They did not serve the spouse of the heir. Any prince would arrive at his marriage already trained, on message, integrated into the household machine, according to the structural assumption that governed the place. A bride should function as a docile extension of that machine. Diana arrived at 19, untrained, emotionally volatile, and already in the early stages of an eating disorder. The grey suits held no idea what to do with her, so they mostly did nothing. That nothing formed its own type of cruelty. Diana wanted help. She wanted instruction on how to handle the press, clarity on what her role would entail, and someone, anyone, to sit down with her and explain the system she would enter. The grey suits, with very few exceptions, treated her diary as Charles's diary, her press as Charles's press, and her wedding as Charles's wedding. She walked in as the bride, but inside the building she ranked closer to a piece of furniture. When the bulimia became visible, the household response stayed silent. The engagement interview blew up internally, and again the response stayed silent. Diana once sat in the office of Michael Colborne and wept because she could not extract a straight answer about her own schedule, and the household response amounted to institutional embarrassment rather than action. The grey suits did not act with active malice. Indifference renders the picture so striking. They simply did not classify the new Princess of Wales as part of their job description. The marriage didn't just fail because of coldness or volatility. It failed because the building it lived inside had not been constructed to support a young woman in psychological crisis, and no system was going to fix that on the fly. By late 1980, Diana Spencer could not walk to her car without photographers chasing her. The hunting season had opened months before the engagement. The British tabloid market in that era operated under almost no restraint. Photographers camped outside her flat at Coleherne Court. Reporters bribed her doormen, her florist, and her neighbours for tips. A famous photograph of Diana holding two small children at the Young England kindergarten, with the sun behind her revealing the outline of her legs through her skirt, ran in newspapers while she received courtship invitations from the future King of England. Everyone involved knew exactly what they were doing: the photographers who took the picture, the editors who published it, and the public who bought the paper without flinching. The palace, with its army of grey suits, provided exactly zero protective infrastructure. Diana technically remained a private citizen until the engagement was announced, and the palace took the position that it could not formally intervene on behalf of someone who held no official attachment to the institution yet. Technically correct, morally indefensible. A teenage girl was being hunted across London by the most aggressive press corps in the developed world, and the most powerful family in Britain watched from inside a fortress and shrugged. That experience shaped Diana before she ever became a princess. By the time she walked down the aisle in 1981, she had endured 5 months of being treated as global property. The cathedral confirmed a status the press had already imposed on her the previous autumn. Some historians argue that Diana's later complicated relationship with the media, sometimes hating them and sometimes wielding them as weapons against her husband, hardened during this engagement period. She learned that the press could not be controlled. She also learned that the press could be steered if you understood your own face well enough. That second lesson never reached Charles, and it would eventually allow Diana to win every public-facing battle of the divorce a decade later. None of this surfaced in 1981. Back then, she registered only as a teenager being hunted by men with cameras, while her future in-laws looked the other way and the wedding invitations mailed out on schedule. July 29, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral. 3,500 guests inside. An estimated 750 million people watching on television around the world. A wedding so large that the British government temporarily declared the day a public holiday so that the country could stop functioning and watch. Diana arrived in a horse-drawn carriage with her father, Earl Spencer, who was recovering from a stroke and could barely walk down the aisle. The dress, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, trailed a 25-foot train that wrinkled in the carriage and required smoothing as Diana stepped onto the cathedral steps. During the ceremony, she muddled Charles's full name. The bride called him Philip Charles Arthur George instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. Charles, for his part, missed the line about sharing all of Diana's worldly goods. Small slips in retrospect. At the time, they registered as the only cracks visible to a global audience that desperately wanted to see a fairy tale. The Queen Mother and Lady Fairmoy sat in the cathedral watching their plan complete itself. Camilla Parker Bowles also sat there, near the front, wearing a grey hat. Diana later revealed on the Morton tapes that she had searched for Camilla in the crowd because she knew Camilla would be there. The fiancé, who had haunted Diana for 5 months, watched the wedding from the 8th row. After the ceremony, the famous balcony kiss at Buckingham Palace produced one of the most photographed images of the 20th century. The honeymoon began aboard the royal yacht Britannia. Within the first few days at sea, according to Diana, 2 photographs of Camilla fell out of Charles's diary onto the floor while she was unpacking. By the time Britannia docked, the marriage had already entered the phase that would define the next 15 years. A public performance of unity wrapped around a private collapse that nobody outside the household yet suspected. Look at the wedding photographs now and they become unsettling. Diana, 20 years old, smiling at a crowd. Charles, almost 33, smiling at the same crowd. 2 people who had been arranged into a marriage by an institution that wanted an heir first, a tradition second, and a televised pageant somewhere lower down on the list of priorities. Above ground, a fairy tale. Below ground, machinery. The machinery had broken before delivery. The cathedral preserved the appearance of celebration for a few hours that July afternoon. By the time Britannia sailed out of Gibraltar Harbour on the honeymoon, the photographs already lay in the diary, the bulimia already raged, and the heir to the British throne already confessed to friends that he could not name what love actually meant. It turns out the engagement interview had not registered as a slip after all. Across the next 16 years of public service, 2 children, a panorama interview, and a Paris tunnel, those 5 words on live television in February 1981 had been doing exactly what they sounded like. They had registered as an answer. August 27, 1995, at the Royal Brompton Hospital in Chelsea. A man named Joseph Toffolo lies in recovery after a triple bypass, and sitting beside his bed, keeping his wife company, is the most photographed woman on the planet. A cardiothoracic registrar walks in to check the patient's progress, nods at the Princess of Wales, and turns back to the notes. Una Shanley Toffolo, the patient's wife and an acupuncturist who knew Diana well, later described that first moment to biographer Kate Snell, and Snell's summary of it lands like a slap. Rarely in her whole life did Diana land so softly on another human being. The surgeon studied the chart, and Diana might as well have been furniture. Khan told the Metropolitan Police the same thing 9 years later, under oath, in a witness statement that would eventually be read aloud in the Royal Courts of Justice. He paid her minimal attention, did not recognise her immediately, and treated her no differently from the other visitors loitering around a post-operative patient, not the reaction she usually drew. 2 years after that nod, Diana would be dead in Paris, and this man would sit alone at Westminster Abbey in dark sunglasses, saying nothing to anyone, turning down enough tabloid money to buy a house, and keeping his mouth shut for the better part of a decade. Somewhere between the chart and the funeral, a 2-year romance happened almost entirely in the dark, inside a car boot, under a wig, on the phone to a hospital switchboard under a fake name. None of it should have worked. The question in the title is whether she really wanted to marry him. So let us find out who actually testified to what, who guessed, and which parts of the legend survive contact with a sworn police witness statement. Some of them do not. Start with the evidence for the romantic version because it is genuinely strong. Khan himself confirmed to police that the two of them talked about marriage and looked seriously at moving abroad together to build a life. Rosa Monckton, who holidayed with Diana weeks before her death, and Lady Jemima Khan, who moved between London and Lahore and understood exactly what a Pakistani marriage would demand, both stated on the record that Diana regarded this surgeon as the love of her life and would have moved to Pakistan for him. Paul Burrell, the royal butler, claimed she called Khan her soulmate and asked him to consult a Catholic priest about arranging an interfaith wedding quietly. Now, the other column of the ledger. Khan told police that neither of them ever proposed, and his words for it carry no ambiguity. We never actually proposed to each other. He explained why, and the explanation contains no romance whatsoever, only logistics. Marrying Diana would turn his life into what he flatly called hell because of who she was, would end any hope of a normal career, and would leave any children of theirs unable to go anywhere or do anything without a lens pointed at them. He also confirmed that Diana initially entertained the idea of moving to Pakistan or South Africa, and then, somewhere between the enthusiasm and the logistics, changed her mind about the whole thing. That is not a woman packing. His summary of where she landed: I got the impression she did not consider living in Pakistan a possibility. And then, 3 weeks after she ended it, she boarded a yacht with someone else. So the honest verdict on the title runs like this: partly supported because she wanted him and talked about marrying him. Nobody ever proposed, nobody ever found the practical route to a marriage, and the man at the centre of it spent the rest of his life explaining, patiently, that the whole thing broke on obstacles unconnected to how much anybody loved anybody. That is a better story anyway. Rewind and go somewhere the paparazzi never bothered to look. Hasnat Ahmad Khan arrived on April 1, 1958, in Jhelum, a city in the Punjab province of Pakistan, into an upper-middle-class Pashtun family, the eldest of 4 children. Not a peasant story, not a palace story, just a solid provincial family with money, education, and opinions. His father, Rashid Khan, graduated from the London School of Economics, then returned home and built a glassware manufacturing business. This is a family that already knew Britain, already knew what British institutions look like from the inside, and did not need the Princess of Wales to introduce them to Kensington. The London School of Economics is not a place you stumble into. The real authority in the household, though, belonged to his grandmother, Mrs. Farkhunda Ayub, known inside the family as Nanny Appa, who kept the traditional customs and firm views about who in this family marries whom. Remember her, because she ends up drinking tea at Kensington Palace. One more piece of family furniture. Khan is a distant cousin of Imran Khan, cricket legend and future Prime Minister of Pakistan, whose then-wife Jemima happened to be one of Diana's close friends. Convent school in Jhelum, then A-levels, then King Edward Medical College in Lahore. He qualified with an MBBS in 1984 and began general medical and surgical training at Mayo Hospital in Lahore, which is where he learned medicine with his hands, at speed, on whoever came through the door. Nobody there knew his name either. In 1987, the Australian Medical Council selected him for cardiothoracic surgical residency in Sydney, and he worked there until 1991, by which point he could operate inside 2 different medical cultures on opposite sides of the planet, then London, and the NHS training pathway. A PhD from Imperial College, plus a fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, which is roughly the highest thing the British surgical system hands out to anybody. So, by 1995, the man walking into that recovery room carried training from 3 continents in a job where a 2mm error kills the patient on the table. By 1995, Khan worked as a senior cardiothoracic registrar and assistant cardiac surgeon at the Royal Brompton, under the leading consultants of the day, and his colleagues remembered a man who routinely put in 90-hour weeks. Everyone who described him used roughly the same vocabulary, down to earth, serious about the clinical work to the point of humorlessness, and completely uninterested in high society charity galas or anything else that required a dinner jacket and 30 minutes of conversation with a stranger holding a champagne flute. Khan told police that press attention threatened his clinical focus and his standing as a surgeon. According to the police statement and to investigative reporting on the Brompton period, Diana returned to that hospital almost daily for 3 weeks after Toffolo's surgery, ostensibly to support the Toffolos, using the visits to pursue conversation and familiarity with the surgeon who ignored her. The Princess of Wales, in the middle of the most public marital collapse in modern British history, with a media apparatus tracking her hairdresser, decided that the route to a man's attention ran through his workplace every day for a month and through a real interest in his job. Not a ball, not an introduction through friends, but a hospital corridor. As she kept coming back for the Toffolos, Khan noticed something he did not expect, a real, unforced curiosity about how the hospital actually functioned, from the theatre lists down to the recovery ward. Not a photo opportunity, but questions. The one detail everybody quotes from this period comes from Simone Simmons, Diana's energy healer, who wrote in her 2005 memoir that Diana called her the moment she left the hospital and announced the arrival of her Mr. Wonderful, then talked at some length about the man's eyes. Memorable and entirely unverified, surviving second-hand through a memoir that the police investigation graded low reliability. Nobody else heard it. The first date, if you can call it that, arrived in September 1995 with all the romance of a supply run. Khan told police that he ran into Diana on her way out of the hospital and mentioned, in passing, that he needed to drive up to his uncle's house in Stratford-upon-Avon to collect some medical books. Small talk, the kind of thing you say in a doorway. She invited herself along. They drove to Warwickshire, collected the books, ate at a local restaurant, and drove back to London. For a woman whose entire adult life ran on a schedule drawn up by other people and photographed by strangers, a spontaneous 4-hour round trip to fetch books off a shelf may well have counted as the most exotic thing available in England. She took it. Now the logistics, which ran for 2 years and required a butler. You cannot date Diana in public, so they did not, and what they built instead ran as a 2-year concealment operation of aliases, disguises, side doors, and a car with a roomy boot. The alias came first. When Diana rang the Royal Brompton switchboard or left messages with surgical staff for Khan, biographers report that she gave the name Dr. Armani, and nobody on the switchboard ever queried it, not a subtle pseudonym. Then the transport. Paul Burrell, the royal butler, claimed he routinely drove Khan into Kensington Palace in the boot of his car, folded up behind the parcel shelf, to carry him past the photographers permanently parked outside. That claim comes from Burrell, whose reliability the police graded as low to moderate because his memoirs contradict primary records at several points and because Burrell is always, in every anecdote he tells, the hero of the story. But the boot detail sits in the same category as the rest of the concealment mechanics. Individually unverifiable, collectively consistent with two people out of options. Believe the pattern, not the butler. The disguises belong to Diana. Burrell and various biographers describe large dark wigs and oversized sunglasses worn so she could stand in a queue at a cinema, sit at Ronnie Scott's jazz club, and drink in ordinary London pubs. Khan confirmed the pub part under oath, and his version carries the detail that sticks. Diana delighted in ordering her own drinks at a bar and in queuing for entry to places because 15 years of royal status ruled out both. She wore a wig to experience the thrill of waiting in line. Inside her circle, the nicknames multiplied. Mr. Wonderful, the One, my dishy doctor, all of them attributed, all of them reaching us through confidants and staff rather than from Diana's own hand, and repeated so many times since 1997 that they now feel like documented fact. They are not. The part of this relationship that sounds invented happens to be the part Khan swore to himself. Diana spent hours at the Royal Brompton in surgical scrubs and a mask, watching him work his way through open-heart bypasses and valve repairs on strangers. Nobody photographed it. Her public identity rested on visiting the sick, while cameras recorded her doing it, and here, off-duty and invisible, she chose to watch a man save lives just to understand his world. She also read about Islamic history and Pakistani culture, according to associates, and kept his photograph on her private desk. Rumours that she planned to convert to Islam circulated for years afterwards and circulate still, which is what happens when a Christian princess is seen reading about a religion most of the British press could not describe without reaching for a photograph of a minaret. Khan killed them under oath. He never asked her for a conversion, and she never offered one. May 1996. Diana travelled to Pakistan on a philanthropic tour, the kind of trip that generates 1,000 photographs of a princess with a shawl over her hair. Then she slipped the leash, detouring away from the official programme to Lahore and to Jhelum to meet Khan's parents, Rashid and Nahid Khan, and his extended family. She wore shalwar kameez. In a traditional Pashtun family, meeting the parents is not a milestone, it is an audit. The auditors did not hide their findings. Biographer Kate Snell attributed to Khan's father the view that the marriage would not survive a year on the grounds that the two of them came from what he called different planets. 2 months later, in July 1996, the audit ran in the opposite direction. Investigative reporting places Nanny Appa, the family matriarch, and assorted relatives at Kensington Palace taking afternoon tea with the Princess of Wales. The following month, the decree absolute landed, and Diana walked out of the House of Windsor as a private citizen with a title, an office, and a boyfriend. Nobody outside the household knew about. Worth adding one thing about the year before. In November 1995, Diana sat down with Martin Bashir for the BBC Panorama interview that detonated what remained of her marriage and rearranged the rest of her life across a single evening of television. Khan revealed, in a 2021 press interview, that he privately told her not to do it. She did it anyway. So did they plan a wedding or not? The evidence splits into two piles that refuse to be reconciled, and this is where most retellings quietly cheat, by picking whichever pile flatters the version of Diana they walked in with. Pile 1, the butler's pile. Burrell claimed in his memoirs and at the inquest that in late 1996, Diana instructed him to approach a Roman Catholic priest and ask whether a Christian woman could marry a Muslim man privately without converting. He described a secret wedding under active investigation. Kate Snell and Tina Brown, along with Rosa Monckton and Jemima Khan, documented Diana exploring cross-border marriage plans and asking for guidance on how Pakistani matrimonial custom actually worked. That is a real body of testimony from named people who knew her. Pile 2, the surgeon's pile, which happens to be sworn. When police investigators put Burrell's priest story to Khan directly, he did not soften it, and he called it a ridiculous idea. He described how Diana handled every practical objection he raised. She told him it would all be fine, because telling people it would all be fine served, in his account, as her answer to everything. Khan evaluated concrete career and family risks, while Diana relied on the charm that always carried her past obstacles. Not as a plan, but as a temperament. The gap between those two piles is not a contradiction about facts, but about what the relationship even amounted to. For him, obstacles formed the load-bearing walls of an actual life. Both people can be telling the truth here, which is the part most retellings of this romance refuse to sit with, because one of them is describing a hope and the other is describing a schedule. The relocation plan existed, though, and Khan confirmed it under oath. They discussed leaving Britain for somewhere with less tabloid infrastructure, and they reached the stage of a shortlist. 3 candidates: Australia, where he trained for 4 years and knew the surgical system; South Africa, where Diana kept family; and Pakistan, where his own family lived. Khan's own logic ran blunt. Pakistan represented the only workable mechanism for a normal family life, because Pakistan gave him standing, family, protection, and a press with no commercial interest in stalking a European princess through a supermarket. Australia and South Africa amounted to compromises, while Pakistan alone could actually run. And then, in his account, the initial enthusiasm cooled and reality arrived. She did not, he told police, consider living in Pakistan a possibility. Jemima Khan, who performed that exact move herself and knew precisely what it cost a European woman to live inside a Pakistani family, insisted Diana would go. Snell reported the same, and both of them knew Diana well. Neither of them sat in the room for the conversation where she worked out that it could not happen. The relocation plan died on simple arithmetic. William and Harry stayed bound to England by succession and schooling, and one of them would one day be king. She could not take them, and she would never leave them behind. No amount of "it will all be fine" could move that. Now, the part that documentaries about this romance tend to skip, presumably because it ruins the mood, Khan revealed under oath that during the relationship and after it, he received anonymous racist hate mail and death threats from members of the British public who objected to a Pakistani Muslim man dating Diana. Not one letter, but a pattern. So when the tabloid version of this story frames him as the commitment phobe who could not step up and marry her, hold that next to the correspondence arriving through his letterbox. One barrier turns out not to exist at all, and it is the one everybody assumes. According to the Operation Paget report, the official police investigation into the conspiracy theories, Diana's exploration of a future with Hasnat Khan met no formal opposition from the royal family. Charles reportedly raised no objection to her finding happiness privately. No palace veto existed, and no men in grey suits existed either, which deletes the explanation most people reach for when they ask why this romance failed. July 1997. Diana took William and Harry to Saint-Tropez as guests of Mohammed Al Fayed at his compound, aboard his boats, in front of a photographic press pack that Al-Fayed showed precisely zero interest in discouraging. She stayed from roughly July 11 to July 20, and there she met Dodi Al-Fayed. She came back to London and ended it with Khan. In his account, she did not seem her normal self, and when he asked her directly whether she met someone in the Al-Fayed circle, she denied it. Weeks later, they met again, and she used the phrase, "all over between us," then denied a new romance a second time. Then, in August, she boarded the Jonikal for a Mediterranean cruise with Dodi Al-Fayed, and the photographs of the two of them ran on every front page in Europe within days. Khan saw them like everybody else. There are three accounts of how this ended. Account A comes from Khan, under oath, in a police witness statement. Diana ended it in London after Saint-Tropez while denying to his face that another man existed. This is the best evidenced version, graded high confidence, and Burrell's timeline supports parts of it. It is also the least dramatic. Account B comes from Rosa Monckton, who testified at the inquest that Khan initiated the split because he could no longer stand the press pressure and that it hurt Diana badly. Monckton counts as a named and credible friend. She is also, on this specific point, contradicted by the man himself, and she reported what Diana told her rather than what she witnessed. Account C is the tabloid theory that hardened into common knowledge, and it belongs to Andrew Morton in his post-1997 editions and to Imran Khan, a distant cousin of Khan's. In this version, Diana never meant to end anything permanently, and she staged the Dodi photographs herself. The entire August spectacle, the yacht, the cruise, the photographs, theatre, designed to detonate jealousy in a surgeon in London and force him to commit. That version requires Diana to be a manipulator running an operation. Khan himself rejected it. Telling police he understood why she turned to Dodi, he laid out reasoning that carried no self-pity whatsoever. She wanted somebody happy to be seen with her in public, and Dodi could do that. He noted, without complaint, that the Al-Fayed fortune bought private security infrastructure that an NHS surgeon on a registrar's salary could never have provided, no matter how much he loved her. Khan swore he knew nothing about the Dodi romance until late August 1997. The relationship ended in late July, and through August the photographs of Diana and Dodi ran on every front page in Europe, on television and on the radio he happened to have on between shifts. He learned it from a news bulletin. At the end of August 1997, Diana died in Paris. Photographers chased the car, and Dodi Al-Fayed died alongside her in it, which turned every warning Khan gave her over 2 years into a coroner's problem. The pursuit he kept describing just killed her. September 6, 1997, at Westminster Abbey, Khan arrived alone, wore dark sunglasses, sat among the congregation and sought no attention from anyone. In the weeks that followed, he turned down every tabloid check put in front of him and returned to the operating theatre to carry on doing bypasses in London while the country outside mourned her on television. 7 years of silence. Then, in 2004, he sat down with Lord Stephen's Operation Paget investigators and gave a full on-the-record account, not to sell anything, but because a police inquiry needed his testimony to knock down a conspiracy theory eating the facts alive. The document at the centre of this video is Khan's witness statement to the Metropolitan Police, dated September 24, 2004. Almost everything we can call documented about this relationship comes from it, and almost everything repeated about this relationship on television comes from somewhere else entirely. Mind that gap. By the time the inquest convened at the Royal Courts of Justice in 2008, Khan lived outside UK jurisdiction. He used his legal right to refuse compulsory appearance as a witness. His explanation, given to the press in January 2008, reads less like evasion and more like exhaustion. Sometimes, he told a reporter, he feels like screaming because he has moved on and it keeps coming back. A barrister read the 2004 statement aloud in open court on March 3, 2008, entering his full testimony into the public record in his absence. One more thing that statement did, and it has nothing to do with romance. Mohammed Al-Fayed spent years alleging that Diana died pregnant and that the pregnancy explained a murder plot. Khan, in a position to know, testified that Diana stayed very particular about taking her contraceptive pills throughout their 2 years together, which is a sentence he delivered to police officers about a woman he loved. In May 2006, Khan entered an arranged marriage in Pakistan with Hadia Sher Ali. The couple separated after 18 months, around late 2007, and finalized the divorce in July 2008. Newspapers with no business doing it dissected the breakdown at length. None of it goes in this video, because he remains a living private citizen who has never sold a word of his private life to anyone. The career kept moving. He resigned his consultant post at Harefield Hospital in November 2007 to head a cardiac hospital in Malaysia. Later, he returned to Britain as a consultant cardiothoracic surgeon at Basildon and Thurrock University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust. He also directs charitable humanitarian cardiac units in Badlote, near Jhelum, the district he grew up in, and the cardiac work there cost the patients nothing. He has broken silence exactly twice, and both times to correct the record about somebody else. August 2013, a feature film about the relationship arrived, directed by Oliver Hirschbiegel, with Naomi Watts as Diana, and its promotional campaign implied Khan's tacit acceptance. He gave none. Stepping on the record in the press, he called the film a complete lie, denied approving anything, and described the production as built on hypotheses and gossip. January 2021. He spoke to the Daily Mail 24 years after her death, and he broke silence because the popular portrayal of Diana kept drifting toward mental instability. He pushed back. She came across, in his professional assessment, as a very normal person with great qualities, plus some drawbacks and bad habits, like every other human being. In the same interview, he stated his belief that Martin Bashir manipulated her vulnerabilities to obtain the 1995 Panorama interview, the interview Khan told her not to give. Four things remain genuinely unknown. Any documentary that pretends otherwise is guessing at you in a serious voice. Nobody knows the emotional mechanics of the July 1997 rupture. Khan swore she ended it, while Monckton testified he ended it. Whether Diana walked out before she could be rejected, or whether Khan finally issued an ultimatum about public exposure, sits in an evidentiary gap that no witness statement fills. Nobody knows what Dodi Al-Fayed actually meant to her, genuine new romance, or staged provocation aimed at a surgeon in London. The only person who could settle that question died alongside him weeks after meeting him, in the car the photographers chased through Paris, which is a poor way to close an argument. Nobody knows whether Diana would have signed the papers. If Khan proposed, if the plan turned real, would she relocate to Pakistan or South Africa and accept the separation from William and Harry that every version of the plan quietly required? Nobody ever tested that conflict, because the proposal never came, and nobody knows what passed between them inside Kensington Palace between 1995 and 1997. Hours and hours of private conversation between two people in an apartment with no recording device survives now only as third-party hearsay and retrospective interpretation, written down years afterwards by people repeating what they remembered. So, did she really want to marry him? On the available sworn evidence, yes, and her named friends testified to it as well. But it never stood a chance, and not because of palace conspiracies or institutional vetoes. The press pack that built her fame turned her unmarriageable for a surgeon who needed 90 hours a week of absolute clinical focus, and the relocation plan died the moment it collided with the custody of a future king. She tried to solve that with wigs, false names, and the assurance that it would all be fine. He solved it by looking at the arithmetic and walking away. If you want the other half of Diana's hidden life, the one that ended a decade before this one started, watch the video on Barry Manakee, the bodyguard she loved and lost first. The pattern is not a coincidence. There's a particular kind of ghost that haunts the British tabloid imagination, and Dodi Fayed has played one for nearly 30 years. Ever since a Mercedes hit a tunnel pillar in Paris and turned a real man into a permanent caption frozen in newsprint, a figure compressed into a single photograph and a single adjective: Egyptian playboy, cocaine party boy, the boyfriend in the car. Pick up any British newspaper from August 1997 and you'll meet this ghost. He has no childhood worth mentioning in those pages, no named mother, no career outside Hollywood gossip columns. His whole existence collapses into a single function: the man sitting next to the Princess of Wales when the Mercedes hit the 13th pillar in the Alma Bridge tunnel at 23 minutes past midnight. Now pick up his father's lawsuits, his father's funded biographies, his father's bronze memorial statues displayed for years on the ground floor of Harrods, and you'll meet a different ghost entirely. The martyred prince of a future royal dynasty. Fiancé of the most photographed woman on earth, future stepfather to the heir to the British throne, a man Prince Philip personally ordered MI6 to assassinate because he was an Egyptian Muslim who dared to love a princess. Both ghosts are nonsense. The first version reads as lazy tabloid shorthand from journalists who never bothered to research a man whose entire backstory sat in public court filings. The second version reads as the fever dream of a grieving father who could not accept that his son had died because the driver was drunk and nobody had buckled a seatbelt. The actual Imad el-Din Mohammed Abdel Monem Fayed, or Dodi Fayed, lived for 42 years before that tunnel in Paris. Almost none of what you think you know about him is correct. So let's bury those ghosts properly. Let's look at the man underneath the cartoon and underneath the statue. Because the documented record turns out sadder, stranger, and more human than either version Britain has been served since 1997. Imad el-Din was born on the 15th of April, 1955, in Alexandria, the cosmopolitan Mediterranean port that had been hosting wealthy Egyptian, Greek, Italian, and Levantine families for generations. The Alexandria of 1955 teetered on the edge of disappearing. Gamal Abdel Nasser had taken the presidency the year before. The Suez Crisis loomed a year ahead, and an old multicultural elite had begun its long bleed out into European exile, with the children of that elite scattering across Geneva and London and Paris for the rest of the century. Imad el-Din came first among Mohammed Fayed's children, born to Mohammed's first wife, Samira Khashoggi. That sentence sounds simple, but it is not simple at all. Tucked inside those names sits the genetic material of 3 decades of geopolitical scandal that would echo through Dodi's life and shape the family he could never quite escape. Samira's brother, Adnan Khashoggi, would become the most famous arms dealer of the 20th century. Adnan brokered weapons deals between Western governments and Middle Eastern royalty, took his cut, and spent that cut on yachts and parties that became their own kind of geopolitical signaling. Through Samira's family connections, Mohammed Fayed gained access to the kind of money and the kind of rooms that turn a clever Egyptian businessman into a player on the global stage, particularly in Dubai during the early 1960s oil boom. The marriage itself did not survive even 2 years. Mohammed and Samira divorced in 1956 when their only child barely walked. From that moment forward, Emad Eldin existed in a strange custody pattern. His mother lived but stayed mostly absent. His father appeared in his son's life only between flights, and the actual work of raising him fell to staff, schools, and a rotating cast of relatives across at least 3 countries. Samira would die in 1986, a heart attack that took her without warning when Dodi turned 31. She had been mostly a phantom in his childhood. Her death turned the phantom permanent. This counts as the first thing the tabloids erased. Dodi Fayed had a mother, and losing her in 1986 broke something in him that never went back together properly, and his behavior in the 11 years that followed bears the imprint of that absence. The original family surname carried no prefix in any document predating the 1970s, no nobility, no ancient lineage hidden in the consonants. Just Fayed. The whole costume came later, applied by Mohammed himself, for reasons of marketing rather than ancestry, which is the part the family rarely volunteers. Mohammed Fayed added the al sometime in the 1970s. He did not inherit the prefix, nor did he discover it in a forgotten branch of his family tree. The man glued it on because it sounded better to Western ears, because it suggested a patrician Arab lineage that the Fayed family did not actually possess. A UK Department of Trade and Industry investigation into his takeover of Harrods documented this in detail. The British press mocked it relentlessly for decades, and the mockery is part of why Mohammed Fayed never received the British citizenship he spent his life chasing. The owl worked as a costume that Mohammed wore the way other men wear hairpieces, and the wearing of it shaped every public-facing decision he made for the next 40 years, including, eventually, the way he managed his own dead son's reputation. Dodi grew up inside a family whose own surname was being rewritten in real time by a father obsessed with how he appeared to the British establishment. Identity in the Fayed household worked like a marketing decision. Heritage came as something you could purchase and renovate, the same way Mohammed would eventually purchase and renovate Harrods, the Paris Ritz, and Fulham Football Club. If your father can change your last name to chase status, what else can he change? Almost everything. The answer ran from his schooling to his professional title to the way history would eventually remember him. Dodi's childhood resembled a passport stamp collection that ran from Alexandria to Dubai to Geneva to Paris to London, none of which ever quite became home. That is what happens to children of the global wealthy. You become a citizen of hotels, a passport with too many stamps, and no particular country willing to claim you as one of its own. His formal schooling came at the Institut Le Rosey in Switzerland, the kind of place where the children of shahs, dictators, oil sheikhs, and minor European royalty learn to ski, and to nod politely in 4 languages. Le Rosey provides an introduction service for the international ruling class, dressed up as a boarding school. The real curriculum is the contact list you leave with. After Le Rosey, the official biography says he attended the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. This is technically true and entirely misleading in the way that almost everything about the Fayed family's public-facing record turns out to be technically true and entirely misleading. Sandhurst commissions British Army officers through a brutal 44-week training program that ends with the Sovereign's Parade. Dodi did not do this, nor did he come anywhere near doing this. He attended instead a short, special course. Sandhurst occasionally ran for the sons of wealthy foreign dignitaries, a finishing school version of military life with the brutality filed off. His father's geopolitical connections arranged the placement, as documented in biographer Brian Brown's 2007 research from the period. The course produced no commission, no rank, only a line on a CV. So when British tabloids in the 1990s described Dodi as Sandhurst trained, with the implication that he had survived the same crucible as British officers, they were participating in his father's preferred fiction. He had been there, but he had not done that. In 1979, Mohammed Fayed founded a production company called Allied Stars and installed his son in it. No film school education backed him, no apprenticeship in any below-the-line craft, no track record of any kind in the film business. His father, however, kept writing very large checks. The company's first major credit came with Breaking Glass in 1980, a British rock and roll drama that did fine without being remembered. Then came Chariots of Fire. The production would define Dodi Fayed's professional reputation for the rest of his life, and afterward more than anything else he ever attached his name to. Chariots of Fire won Best Picture at the 1982 Academy Awards. Dodi Fayed received an executive producer credit. Walk into any IMDb page or any obituary and you will see those 2 facts placed next to each other, and you will be invited to draw the obvious conclusion. He was an Oscar-winning producer, but not in any meaningful sense of those words. The actual creative engine behind Chariots of Fire was David Putnam, who had spoken for years developing the project and putting the elements together. When the production ran out of money mid-shoot, Mohammed Fayed wrote a rescue cheque of approximately £1.5 million, and in exchange, the family received producer credits. David Putnam himself, after Dodi's death, took pains to publicly distance himself from the Fayed family and clarify the historical record. Dodi, in Putnam's account, had virtually no creative involvement and was frequently absent from set. He carried a name on a contract. The cheque had purchased the appearance of authorship, in much the same way the "al" prefix had purchased the appearance of aristocracy a decade earlier. The filmography that followed kept up the pretense. F. X in 1986. F. X2 in 1991. Hook the same year, where his credit came largely from early rights acquisition rather than any actual hands-on producing. The Scarlet Letter with Demi Moore in 1995, a critical disaster of historic proportions that remains, even now, a strong contender for the worst Hester Prynne ever committed to film. In each case, Dodi's name appears on the credits in the financier and packager position rather than the line-producing trenches. He brought money and introductions, but, in the boring daily sense, never produced any of the films his name appeared on. But people who worked with him in this period mostly liked him. He came across as soft-spoken, polite, generous in person, not a screamer or a tantrum thrower in a town where screaming and tantrum throwing was the regional sport. The Hollywood crowd is full of obnoxious money guys with worse manners. Dodi made easy company, simply not a filmmaker, and when his father got cold feet on a project or decided to tighten the spigot, the checks would stop, bills would go unpaid, hotel accounts would lapse. So we have a man in his 30s and 40s producing films he doesn't really produce, supported by an allowance that biographers placed at roughly $100,000 per month. Call it what it actually is. The allowance deserves a closer look. It explains things that nothing else explains about Dodi Fayed's behavior in his 30s and 40s, particularly his inability to commit to any project, person, or location without his father's continued financial backing. $100,000 a month in 1990s. Money comes to $1.2 million a year for a single bachelor who already had his housing, his cars, his security, and most of his social life subsidized through the larger Fayed business empire. By any normal measure, the number is unspendable. Most people in their 40s would simply accumulate a fortune and quietly grow rich. Dodi managed to spend it all. Sometimes he burned through it faster than it arrived, requiring his father's accountants in London to wire emergency top-ups across the Atlantic on short notice. The cocaine drew no secrecy. Tom Bower's biography and the Vanity Fair investigation from 1997 both documented his cocaine use as a routine feature of his Hollywood years, not as a tabloid rumor, but as something his actual circle confirmed on the record. He never reached chaotic addict territory, by all accounts. He functioned as a high-functioning user in a town, and an era where high-functioning use formed the wallpaper of the industry he had bought his way into. The bounced checks drew no secrecy either. He paid late, or partially, or occasionally not at all, waiting for someone in London to clean it up before any embarrassment could leak into the press. In the most precise and literal sense, he had never faced the consequences of his own spending. Every time he hit the bottom of the account, his father refilled the account. Around him, his peers in their late 30s and 40s had children, mortgages, divorces, businesses they had built or destroyed on their own credit. Dodi had none of that. Instead, he kept an allowance and a permanent adolescence, lived in Malibu and Mayfair and the south of France, photographed at premieres for films he had paid to be associated with. And then came the summer of 1997. For a brief stretch of weeks, it looked, against all prior evidence, and against all the patterns of his previous 4 decades, like Dodi Fayed might be about to become an adult. In that summer of 1997, Dodi Fayed had become engaged to a 29-year-old American model named Kelly Fisher. The engagement was real. Not the staged tabloid romance that the British press had retroactively assigned to his earlier years with figures like Brooke Shields, all of which the supposed partners had denied as purely public relations fictions invented to keep Dodi's name in the gossip columns. Kelly Fisher was different. Dodi had purchased a house in Malibu. Specific financial promises sat in legal filings. Dodi had told her he wanted her to scale back her modeling career so they could build a life together. And according to the lawsuit she eventually filed in Los Angeles County Superior Court, he had offered her $500,000 to do exactly that. The dollar figure appears in the original complaint filed by Fisher's attorney, Gloria Allred, in the Los Angeles County Superior Court in August 1997. In July of 1997, Mohammed Fayed invited Princess Diana and her 2 sons to holiday at his villa in Saint-Tropez. He summoned Dodi to join them. Dodi flew in from where he had been spending time with Kelly Fisher on a yacht moored nearby in the south of France. Fisher remained on the yacht while Dodi headed up to his father's villa 1 harbour over to entertain a princess. For most of August, Fisher did not know what was happening. She thought she was waiting for her fiancé, but in actual fact, she was waiting for a man who, in real time, had transferred his attention to the most photographed woman on Earth and was not coming back to her boat. When the story broke and Dodi did not return, Fisher hired the attorney Gloria Allred and filed a breach of contract suit. The suit landed in mid-August 1997. Roughly 2 weeks later, Dodi Fayed lay dead in a Paris tunnel, and Fisher dropped the lawsuit out of respect for his family. A grown man, engaged to one woman, abandoned her on a yacht in the south of France while he sailed off with another. A real person on a real yacht in a real harbour ended up hurt by his choices, and her hurt is part of his historical record. It also tells you something about the speed at which the Diana relationship unfolded. The relationship between Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, lasted less than 2 months. People who have absorbed the conspiracy literature talk about Dodi and Diana the way they talk about Charles and Camilla, as if it had been a long-running affair of state. It amounted to a holiday romance, a spectacular paparazzi-saturated, internationally watched holiday romance, sure, but a holiday romance. It began at Mohammed Fayed's villa in Saint-Tropez in July 1997, and it played out almost entirely at sea, on the Fayed family yacht called the Joni Carl, which would become the principal setting for what remained of their lives. Diana and Dodi cruised the Mediterranean through August. Photographers shot them constantly, and those pictures sold for prices that would, in retrospect, become part of the murder weapon that killed them both. What actually happened between them stays harder to know. The people who knew Diana best disagree with the people who knew Mohammed best in ways that are not coincidental and that map almost perfectly onto each side's incentives after the crash. Diana's closest confidantes, including her friend Rosa Monckton and Lady Annabel Goldsmith, provided detailed testimony to the Operation Paget investigation in the years that followed. Their account stays consistent. According to that account, Diana enjoyed herself, found Dodi affectionate and kind, a generous man who treated her with care during a period of her life when most of the attention coming her way did the opposite. She harbored no intention of marrying him, no pregnancy existed, and conversion to anything had never appeared on her schedule. By all credible accounts, she remained a recently divorced 36-year-old woman, taking a sun-soaked summer with a wealthy man who treated her well and kept her laughing. Mohammed Fayed, after his son's death, would build an entire mythology on the opposite premise, that his son and Diana were secretly engaged, that she carried his grandchild, and that the British state had murdered them both to prevent a Muslim stepfather for the future king, an accusation he repeated in interview after interview for the rest of his life. The forensic evidence in Operation Paget would eventually demolish all of this. Diana was definitively not pregnant. The blood from the Mercedes footwell and an examination of her remains confirmed her condition with the kind of clinical certainty that conspiracy theories cannot survive. The plot did not exist. No MI6 hit team operated, no royal command came down, and no Muslim stepfather panic gripped the British establishment. A man fell in love with a princess over 6 weeks, and then a tunnel arrived. One other detail belongs in this story. From the afternoon of the 30th of August, 1997, the last day either Diana or Dodi would live to see the sun rise. A ring. The ring, the CCTV footage, the receipt all exist as part of the public record, photographed and cross-referenced and entered into the evidentiary chain by both French and British investigators in the years that followed. On the afternoon of the 30th of August, 1997, Dodi Fayed walked into the Alberto Repossi jewellery store in Paris and purchased a ring from a collection called Dis-moi oui. The name translates, with no subtlety whatsoever, as "tell me yes." Surveillance footage from the store recorded the visit, and the receipt sits in the public record. What the ring meant has been argued about ever since. Operation Paget interviewed everyone who knew Diana well enough to know what actually occupied her mind during those weeks. The conclusion came out straightforward and unanimous. Diana viewed the ring, if she viewed it at all before the crash, as a friendship gift or at most a pre-engagement token of affection from a wealthy man who liked dramatic gestures. On the night of the crash, she was not about to accept a marriage proposal. The people closest to her have maintained this repeatedly and consistently for more than 2 decades. A man can buy a ring with one set of intentions, while the woman receiving it carries a different set. Dodi may genuinely have hoped Diana would say yes. That does not retroactively turn her engagement to him into a fact, and it certainly does not turn his death into a murder. But the ring, in the hands of a grieving father with infinite money and infinite media access, became the centerpiece of a conspiracy industry that ran for almost 20 years. Mohammed put the ring on display, sent it out for photographs, mentioned it in every interview and press release. The object became the most exhausting prop in modern royal mythology. But for me, the ring stayed just a ring. On the evening of the 30th of August, 1997, Dodi and Diana dined at the Hotel Ritz in Paris, the hotel his father owned. The paparazzi stood at the front entrance in numbers that made any normal departure impossible. So someone improvised. Hasty decisions sent them through the rear of the hotel with a decoy vehicle strategy that nobody had rehearsed and nobody had properly staffed. At approximately 20 minutes past midnight on the 31st, a Mercedes-Benz S280 pulled out from the back of the Ritz. Behind the wheel sat Henri Paul, the acting head of security at the hotel. Trevor Rees-Jones, a former British paratrooper employed by the Fayed organisation, rode shotgun. Dodi and Diana sat in the back. Nobody had buckled a seatbelt, a detail investigators would note repeatedly in the years that followed, and one the coroner's jury would eventually count as contributing to 2 of the 4 deaths. At 23 minutes past midnight, the Mercedes entered the Alma Bridge tunnel at high speed and struck the 13th pillar. The impact destroyed the car. Emergency responders would later describe the wreckage as one of the worst single-car collisions they had ever attended in the centre of Paris, a city not short on bad accidents. Henri Paul died at the scene. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. Diana, Princess of Wales, emerged from the wreckage alive and rode by ambulance to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where she died hours later from internal injuries that, with a seatbelt, she might have survived. Trevor Rees-Jones, the only seat-belted occupant in the car, survived with severe injuries to his face and skull. The French judicial investigation and, later, the Operation Paget Review and the 2008 British coroner's inquest established the technical cause of the crash with a level of detail rare in any traffic fatality. Henri Paul's blood alcohol registered more than 3 times the French legal limit. His system also contained therapeutic doses of fluoxetine, marketed in the United States as Prozac and Tiopride, a medication used in alcohol withdrawal treatment. Both of these drugs interact dangerously with alcohol. By every clinical measure available, he was not fit to drive a vehicle that night, let alone a luxury sedan at high speed evading a paparazzi pursuit. He should never have sat in that driver's seat. The people who put him there bear part of the weight of what followed. The paparazzi were also pursuing the car at speeds that French and British investigators considered reckless and contributory. They were chasing money. A clear shot of the Princess of Wales that night ran into 6 figures per image, depending on the buyer and the angle. The 2008 British coroner's inquest jury delivered its verdict on the 7th of April. Unlawful killing, grossly negligent driving of the following paparazzi vehicles, and grossly negligent driving of the Mercedes by Henri Paul. The jury identified the failure of the victims to wear seatbelts as a contributing factor in the deaths of Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales. That is the verdict, and that is the documented historical record. No version of events contradicts this verdict without contradicting forensic toxicology, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and the basic laws of physics that govern what happens when a luxury sedan strikes a concrete pillar at high speed. Dodi Fayed received an initial burial at Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, in an Islamic funeral attended by close family. Then he was moved. In October 1997, his remains were reinterred on the grounds of the Fayed family estate at Barrow Green Court in Oxted, where his father could visit him daily and where his father would, over the next quarter century, talk to him. In 2005, Mohammed Fayed unveiled a bronze statue inside Harrods called Innocent Victims. The piece depicted his son and Diana dancing beneath the wings of an albatross. In case the symbolism risked being too restrained, the albatross referred to the seabird associated with grief and the souls of the dead. The statue stood near the Egyptian escalator, alongside a smaller memorial Mohammed had installed in 1998 that held photographs of the couple, a wine glass from their last dinner, and a ring he claimed was the Repossi engagement ring used the night before the Paris crash. It was not the Repossi ring. The actual Repossi ring had been recovered separately and entered into the inquest's evidentiary record years earlier. The memorials were not subtle, nor were they designed to be. They amounted to a department store cathedral honoring the Fayed family's preferred version of events, and tourists filed past them every day for years, treating them as if they constituted public history. In 2010, Mohammed sold Harrods to Qatar Holdings. The new owners tolerated the memorials for almost a decade out of respect for the family. In 2018, they finally removed them and returned them to Mohammed personally. The Innocent Victims statue ended up at Fulham Football Club, the other major Fayed possession at that time, before eventually being sent into private storage and out of public view entirely. This had been the last public-facing infrastructure of the Fayed conspiracy theory, and its removal in 2018 ended the era quietly. By 2023, when Mohammed Fayed himself died, almost no serious commentator outside the conspiracy fringe still entertained the murder narrative. The narrative had been killed 3 times over. Once by the Operation Paget report, again by the coroner's inquest, and finally by time and the steady accumulation of evidence that pointed always in the same direction. The conspiracy industry built around Dodi Fayed's death did not honour his memory. It buried him under his own father's obsessions. For almost 20 years, you could not say his name in public without triggering an argument about MI6 and Prince Philip and pregnancy and engagement and royal cover-ups. The actual man, the actual life, the actual person who had lived for 42 years in 5 different countries and produced bad films and dated models and snorted cocaine and lost his mother and loved a princess for 6 weeks, vanished entirely from his own story. His father killed him a second time. With the best of intentions and the worst possible outcome, Mohammed Fayed spent 20 years erasing his own son to turn him into a martyr. In the spring of 1992, inside one of the oldest stately homes in England, a 62-year-old widow watched household staff stuff her clothes, her jewellery, and her private papers into black plastic refuse sacks. Only days before, she sat through the final hours at her husband's deathbed as the dying Earl slipped away. Now her stepson wanted her gone. The new 9th Earl Spencer wanted it done fast, and the woman they carried out with that week's rubbish answered to a grand title, Reign Countess Spencer, stepmother of the most photographed woman alive, Diana, Princess of Wales. For 16 years she poured her energy and a small fortune into rescuing this very house from rot and ruin. For 16 years the family she married into despised her, mocked her behind her back, and pinned on her a nickname that would trail her into the history books, Acid Rain. How did a romance novelist's daughter, a woman without a drop of inherited blue blood, charm and scheme her way to the summit of England's grandest dynasty? And did the venomous gold digger of tabloid legend ever truly exist? Or has the story buried a stranger, more capable woman? Reign McCorquodale entered the world on the 9th of September 1929 in Mayfair, then the most fashionable quarter of London. Her father, Alexander McCorquodale, drew his money from a family printing empire that supplied much of Britain with its ledgers, forms and stationery. Her mother belonged to a different species entirely. Barbara Cartland, not yet the pink-clad national institution she would later become, already churned out romantic novels at a furious pace, and she met her own life with the same appetite for drama she lent her heroines. Cartland would eventually sell hundreds of millions of books and turn herself into a pink-swathed caricature of romantic excess, dispensing pronouncements on love and chastity from a chaise longue ringed by lapdogs. Long before that fame crested, she fixed on a single ambition for her daughter: polish and conquest. Reign absorbed the lessons young. She learned which fork to lift and which duchess to flatter, and she drilled herself to hold a smile through any humiliation until that smile set into a second skin no rival ever pierced. The marriage of Reign's parents collapsed early and bitterly. They divorced in 1936, when she counted only 7 years old, and her mother soon married Hugh McCorquodale, a cousin of the very husband she just cast aside. Few children of that decade grew up under so theatrical a maternal eye. Cartland did not raise a daughter so much as audition one, drilling into the girl a code of immaculate presentation, relentless social ambition, and the conviction that a woman's surface counted for as much as anything beneath it. A young woman of Reign's class measured her prospects by the season, the annual round of balls and presentations through which debutantes paraded before eligible men and watchful mothers. Birth opened those gates. Money could sometimes buy a ticket, yet the McCorquodale fortune carried the faint taint of trade, of ink and paper and commerce that the grandest families looked down upon. Rain entered this arena already marked as a striver rather than a native inhabitant, and she resolved early to outperform every girl who inherited a place she would have to seize. In later decades, Barbara Cartland enjoyed floating a grander story about her daughter's parentage. She hinted, never quite outright, that Rain's true father sprang not from the printing family at all, but from Prince George, Duke of Kent, a son of King George V. No genealogical record, no surviving letter, no credible witness lends the rumour any weight. The tale belongs among Cartland's own embroideries, the wishful gilding of a woman who preferred her bloodline, brushed, however faintly, with royalty. Rain, raised on such fictions, would spend her life chasing the proximity to greatness her mother could only invent, and unlike Cartland, she would actually reach it in the flesh. By her late teens, Rain grew into a striking young woman who knew exactly how to deploy what she possessed. Tall, immaculately groomed, and armoured in confidence, she dressed with a precision that announced her seriousness about being noticed. She spoke in the clipped, grand accent of her class and carried herself with a poise that read as elegance or as fraudeur, depending entirely on who happened to be watching. People rarely felt neutral about her. From the very start, she split every room she entered into admirers and detractors, and she drew her energy from both camps at once. On the 21st of July, 1948, at the age of 18, Rain married the Honourable Gerald Legge, a young man who would in time inherit the title of 9th Earl of Dartmouth. The wedding announced her arrival in society, and the press of the day fawned over the glamorous bride with the famous, formidable mother. Over the years that followed, the marriage produced 4 children: William, Rupert, Charlotte, and Henry. By any conventional reading, the script of her life seemed settled. A society wife, a clutch of well-bred children, a country house, a diary of luncheons, yet the caricature that would later swallow her whole, the wicked stepmother of fairy tale shorthand, erased something the record refuses to bury. Rain declined to retreat into ornamental domesticity. She wanted a public arena, and she walked out and claimed one. At the age of 23, while still raising small children, she won election to Westminster City Council and entered its chamber as its youngest member, a startling feat for a young woman in the early 1950s. A woman reaching for real power in 1950s, Britain ran hard against the current, with the Commons still a near-total male preserve, and wives of her standing steered toward charity galas and the nursery. Rain ignored all of it. She wanted the committee rooms where decisions actually happened, and she clawed her way into them while her contemporaries arranged flowers. What followed surprised everyone who filed her away as merely decorative. Rain proved a tireless and genuinely effective local politician across nearly 2 decades of public service. She joined the Greater London Council, took the chair of the Covent Garden Development Committee, and threw herself into the unglamorous machinery of planning law, conservation orders, and municipal budgets. Few of her tabloid critics ever bothered to learn this. The woman they would paint as a frivolous parasite spent her best energies fighting, hard and in public, to protect the physical fabric of London itself. As a councillor, Rain earned a reputation for proving impossible to overlook. She mastered procedure, did her homework, and bulldozed opponents with a blend of charm and sheer relentlessness that left committeemen exhausted. In the council chamber, she dressed as though for a gala, and more than one colleague mistook the glamour for frivolity until he tangled with her over a planning vote and learned his error. The very qualities her enemies later read as monstrous, the iron will and the flat refusal to yield, equipped her for public life. She simply pointed them at causes the public could cheer. Covent Garden, the district she fought hardest to save, ran for 3 centuries as London's great fruit, vegetable and flower market, a chaotic and beloved warren of porters, barrows and Georgian arcades planted at the very centre of the city. By the early 1970s, planners wrote off the whole quarter as obsolete clutter ripe for clearance, and they drew up schemes to raise it and bury the muddle under motorways and concrete towers. Whole neighbourhoods across post-war Britain vanished under exactly that logic. Rain studied the bulldozers and the blueprints and decided some things deserved a public fight. The fight she picked ran against the spirit of the age. Across the 1960s and into the 1970s, British planners and architects worshipped the new, treating Victorian terraces and Georgian frontages as embarrassments fit only for the bulldozer. Conservationists who objected drew dismissal as sentimental cranks blocking progress. Rain planted herself on the unfashionable side of that argument and refused to budge, and the districts she defended outlived the concrete utopias her opponents wanted to raise in their place. Her finest hour as a public figure arrived in 1972, and it cost her something to claim it. When officials drew up plans to flatten swathes of historic Covent Garden, replacing centuries of architecture with the brutal modern blocks then in fashion, Rain fought the scheme from inside the system. When the system would not bend, she resigned in protest, surrendering her committee chairmanship to render her opposition impossible to ignore. The gesture worked. Her campaign helped halt the demolition, and the Covent Garden that draws visitors today owes part of its survival to her stubbornness. That single resignation did not exhaust her. Rain fought on in the same years to shield the Tate Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery from redevelopment schemes that threatened to swallow or diminish them. She regarded old buildings as living inheritances rather than obstacles to progress, and she defended them with the same theatrical certainty her mother brought to a love scene. The woman later accused of plundering and vandalising one of England's finest historic houses spent the prime of her career rescuing the nation's historic places from the wrecking ball. The charge and the record refuse to fit together, and anyone who flattens Rain into a simple villain has chosen not to look. Preservation gave Rain her public purpose, and preservation also handed her the love of her life. Sometime around the turn of the 1970s, while sitting on a committee devoted to architectural heritage, she fell into the orbit of Edward John Spencer, known to everyone as Johnny, then Viscount Althorp and heir to one of the most ancient earldoms in the realm. The two shared an obsession that ran deeper than mutual attraction. Both adored old houses, old art, old England, and both believed such things deserved a fierce custodian. On committee business, they recognized in each other a rare and consuming passion, and the rest followed from that recognition. The Spencers reached back to the 15th century, to sheep farming and shrewd marriages that bought land, titles, and a closeness to the crown, and Althorp sheltered them from 1508 onward. Into this fortress walked a divorced romance writer's daughter with a council seat and a vulgar mother. The old families recoiled at her very existence and never let her forget it. The affair began in earnest around 1973. Both still answered to other spouses at the time, and society reacted with the predictable chorus of disapproval because Rain carried the scent of new money and naked ambition into a world that prized inherited blood above everything else. To the old guard, she looked like a climber laying siege to a fortress that should never have admitted her. For a time, the affair held as a discreet, open secret, the kind of arrangement grand society tolerated so long as nobody dragged it into daylight. Rain and Johnny, both still married, conducted their romance under cover of committee work and shared enthusiasm, and the pretense lasted a while. It could not last forever. As the relationship deepened and the gossip thickened, the two of them abandoned discretion and chose each other in the open. Accepting the scandal as the price of a partnership, neither would surrender. Whatever else one says of Rain, she did not hide. She wanted Johnny Spencer, and she would endure being hated to keep him. The moral outrage, when it surfaced, dripped with hypocrisy that few of the outraged cared to examine. Johnny's first wife, Frances Shand Kidd, the mother of his 4 children, including a young girl named Diana, walked out of the marriage years earlier. In 1969, Frances left Johnny for another man. That departure scandalized the very society now clutching its pearls over Rain. The Spencer marriage broke on Frances's side long before Rain appeared, yet the venom would concentrate almost entirely on the second wife. A family that weathered one wife's departure lined up to punish the next wife for both. One detail of that earlier scandal sharpened the cruelty of what followed. When the Spencer marriage reached the courts, Frances lost custody of her children in a verdict that leaned partly on testimony from her own mother against her, a defeat that branded her, in the public mind, as a woman who picked a lover over her babies. The law and the gossip columns punished the wife and spared the husband almost entirely. Now the same machinery cranked back to life for Rain. Society leaned on a long habit of blaming Spencer women for the wreckage of a Spencer marriage, and Rain became the latest woman fitted for the part. Rain and Gerald Legg divorced in 1976, which freed her at last to step fully into the role she wanted. 2 months later, on the 14th of July, 1976, she married Johnny Spencer in a quiet civil ceremony at Caxton Hall in London. She walked out of that registry office as Rain, Countess Spencer, mistress of Althorpe and stepmother to 4 children who already loathed the very sight of her and would spend the next 16 years proving it. The triumph she pursued her whole life lay finally in her hands. The bill for that triumph would arrive later. When Johnny succeeded his father and inherited the Althorpe estate, he gained no glittering prize so much as a beautiful catastrophe. The great house, home to the Spencer family for centuries, sagged under decades of neglect. Dry rot crept through its timbers, water poured through failing roofs, and the crushing weight of British death duties. The inheritance taxes levied whenever one earl succeeded another threatened to finish what time and damp began. A lesser couple might have surrendered the place to the National Trust or watched it crumble. Rain refused either fate. She attacked the problem with the same ferocity she once aimed at London's town planners. The repairs alone would swallow roughly £2 million, a colossal sum, and the estate held no such cash in reserve. To find it, the couple turned to Althorpe's one asset in abundance, art. Over the following years, they sold off whole tranches of the family collection, parting with treasures that hung on those walls for generations. The losses ran to as many as 11 works attributed to Van Dyck from the wider Spencer holdings, alongside canvases by Thomas Gainsborough and portraits by Sir Joshua Reynolds. The collection they began to dismantle ranked among the finest any private English family ever gathered. Generations of Spencers bought boldly and well, crowding Althorpe with old masters that any museum on earth would have coveted. Parting with any of it stung. To sell from such a collection cut against everything Rain claimed to believe about guarding the past, and the irony cannot have escaped her. The preservationist who resigned a public office to save Covent Garden now signed away Van Dyck's to save a roof. She did it regardless, judging that a half-empty house left standing beat a full house fallen into ruin, and history has largely ruled her judgment sound, even as her stepchildren never did. The sales amounted to no smash-and-grab raid carried out by a greedy interloper behind her husband's back. Johnny Spencer, the 8th Earl, authorized every transaction. Master and mistress of the house reached these wrenching decisions together as a partnership, trading paintings they could not afford to keep for a roof that would not collapse on their heads. Rain drove the rescue with characteristic force, and she certainly took the blame for it, yet she did not act alone, and she did not steal what she sold. The £2 million bought more than a fresh coat of paint. The money chased the dry rot out of the timbers, sealed the roofs against the weather that poured through them, and steadied a structure. Decades of neglect drove toward collapse. Visitors, who later sneered at Rain's gilding, rarely paused to picture the buckets catching rainwater in the staterooms before she arrived. She inherited a sick building and spent a fortune curing it, and the cure, however gaudy its finish, kept Althorpe upright. What the money bought provoked as much fury as the selling. Rain redecorated Althorpe's interiors in the bold, gilded, high-gloss style she adored, drenching ancient rooms in bright colour and heavy gold. To her own eye, she restored faded grandeur to its full theatrical glory. To the eye of her stepson Charles, the future 9th Earl, she defaced a national treasure with the taste of a parvenu. He would later deride her handiwork with a line that trailed her for the rest of her life, dismissing the result as the wedding cake vulgarity of a 5-star hotel in Monaco. The phrase stuck because it carried a grain of malice and a grain of truth at once. Her vision for the interiors sprang from the same instinct that governed her whole life. Nothing should ever look tired, faded, or apologetic. Where her stepson saw the dignified patina of age, Rain saw shabbiness that demanded correction, and she corrected it with gilt, lacquer, and colour laid on without the slightest timidity. To one taste, the rooms glowed with restored splendour. To another, they shrieked of money newly arrived and desperate for an audience. The quarrel over those rooms ran deeper than decor. It amounted to a proxy war between an old aristocracy that prized restraint and an outsider who clawed her way in and flatly refused to whisper about it. If the art sales lit the fuse, the children supplied the powder. From the moment Rain entered Althorpe as their father's new wife, the 4 Spencer children, Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles, closed ranks against her with the cold cruelty only the well-born truly master. They lost their mother to one departure, and now watched a stranger install herself in their family's heart. They treated her as an invader and fought her with everything the young and aggrieved can summon. Still raw from their mother's departure, the children aimed all their unresolved fury at the newcomer. Rain drew their fire easily. Brassy, certain, and unapologetic, she swept into their home determined to remake it, and to children already grieving, she resembled a thief stealing the last of their father's attention. The campaign against her ran the full range from petty to vicious. They guarded their territory, froze her out of family rituals, and played pranks designed to wound her dignity. Above all, they branded her with the nickname that would outlive every one of her genuine achievements. Mocking her name and her temper at once, they christened her Acid Rain. And the cruel little pun escaped the walls of Althorpe, travelled through London society, and lodged in the press until the world knew her by it. A woman who saved Covent Garden and chaired committees at the Greater London Council found herself reduced in the public imagination to a stepmother out of Grimm. One of those 4 children would soon overshadow them all. In 1981, the shy, 19-year-old Lady Diana Spencer married the Prince of Wales before a worldwide television audience counted in the hundreds of millions. And overnight, Johnny's youngest daughter turned into the most famous woman on the planet. The girl who helped torment her stepmother now outranked her in every imaginable way. A future queen set against a mere countess by marriage. Reign spent a lifetime climbing toward grandeur. Now, a stepdaughter who despised her outshone it without seeming to try. And Reign, schooled by her mother never to reveal a wound, let nothing slip in public. Then came 1978, and a crisis that should have rewritten her reputation forever. Lord Spencer suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage that nearly killed him, plunging him into a long and desperate illness from which few expected him to return. Through those agonizing weeks, Reign never left his side. She mounted a relentless vigil at his hospital bed, harried his doctors, refused every gloomy prognosis, and willed her husband back toward life with a single-minded devotion that startled everyone who witnessed it. Historians and physicians who studied the episode credit her nursing, plainly and without much hedging, as a central reason Johnny survived at all. The fearsome social climber turned out to love her difficult husband with a fierceness that surprised even those who hated her. That devotion brought her no peace with his children. The feud smoldered through the 1980s and erupted, most famously, in September of 1989, in an incident that beggars the gentle image we hold of the woman it injured. According to the accounts of witnesses close to the family, including Reign's former personal assistant Sue Howe and the royal butler Paul Burrell, Princess Diana, by then the most celebrated woman on earth, shoved her stepmother down a flight of stairs at Althorpe during a family gathering. Reign tumbled down the steps and rose badly bruised. The provocation, as those same accounts tell it, lay in old wounds rather than fresh ones. Diana reportedly seethed because Reign, at a family event, snubbed Frances Shand Kidd, Diana's biological mother, the very woman whose departure set this whole drama in motion 2 decades earlier. We cannot reconstruct the exact words exchanged on that staircase, and the precise sequence rests on the memory of a handful of insiders rather than on any court record. The bruises, though, proved real enough. Only Johnny kept Reign anchored inside the family through all that hostility. On the 29th of March, 1992, he died. With him gone, the fragile truce his love imposed on the household dissolved in an instant. Charles Spencer, now the 9th Earl and Master of Althorpe, owed his stepmother nothing, felt nothing for her but the accumulated grievance of his childhood, and acted on it with brutal speed. He moved against her almost before the grave closed. On Charles's orders, household staff packed her 16 years at Althorpe into the black plastic bin liners a household keeps for its rubbish, a final message of deliberate contempt. The woman who spent her own fortune saving this house found herself bundled out of it like refuse, her grief barely begun. Charles Spencer never pretended to regret the manner of her going. In his eyes, Reign presided over the dispersal of his birthright and the gilding of his ancestral home, and he waited the whole of his childhood and youth to rid himself of her. The bin liners to him fit the woman. Cheap, theatrical, final. Yet even some who shared his low opinion of his stepmother flinched at the spectacle of an elderly widow, turned out with the household waste days after she buried her husband. There sits a difference between winning a feud and grinding a beaten opponent into the dirt. To plenty of onlookers, Charles wandered across it. Cast out, widowed and humiliated, Reign did what Reign always did when life knocked her down. She refused to lie there. Within little more than a year, she stunned society once again, this time by marrying a Frenchman she met only weeks before. On the 8th of July, 1993, she became the wife of Count Jean-François Pinton de Chambrun after a whirlwind courtship that, by most accounts, lasted a mere 33 days. The speed of it scandalized her critics and amused her friends in roughly equal measure. Her detractors whispered that the social climber stood unmasked at last, vaulting from one grand name to another without pausing to mourn. The grand French adventure curdled fast. The marriage her enemies read as proof of her shallowness proved hollow on its own terms, and within roughly 2 years it collapsed. By 1995, Reine and her count divorced. The title of countess discarded almost as fast as she seized it, and she returned to England a Spencer once more in name, shed of a husband, a country, and an illusion inside 2 short years. At 65, twice widowed in spirit if not in law, most observers assumed her improbable run finally ended. They underestimated her, as people generally did. What came next confounded everyone. Few turns in a life already crowded with them, rank stranger. In the years after Johnny's death, around 1993 and 1994, Reine forged a genuine friendship with the one Spencer child the world watched most closely, Diana, Princess of Wales. The 2 women who once shared a staircase shoving match began dining together, often at the Connaught Hotel, 2 famous survivors of the same gilded battlefield comparing scars over dinner. The stepmother and the stepdaughter, sworn enemies for nearly 20 years, discovered more common ground than either ever wished to admit. By the time the 2 women began meeting for dinner, Diana's fairy tale marriage soured into open warfare. Her separation from Prince Charles in 1992 laid bare years of mutual misery, infidelity, and bitter briefing wars waged through a ravenous press. Isolated inside the royal family she married into, estranged from her own mother, and hunted without mercy by photographers, Diana found herself short of allies who grasped the peculiar cruelty of a life lived in a gilded cage. Reine recognized it at once. The stepmother she once shoved down a staircase turned out to rank among the few people alive who knew exactly what Diana endured. And the strangest friendship of either woman's life grew straight out of that bleak common ground. On the warmer reading, both women knew what it meant to marry into rigid grandeur as an outsider, to suffer judgment from people who inherited their status rather than earned it. Diana, locked in her own war with the House of Windsor, may well have recognized in Reine a fellow combatant against the suffocating expectations of aristocratic life. Time and pain pushed them together. 2 women bruised by the same cold machinery found, late and unexpectedly, that they could speak to each other. A colder reading lingers underneath, and the more cynical historians refuse to let it go. By the mid-1990s, Diana grew bitterly estranged from her own mother, Frances Shand Kidd, the same woman whose snubbing once sent Diana flying at Reine on the Althorpe stairs. To embrace Reine, openly and in public, may have handed Diana a pointed weapon against Frances, a way of declaring she preferred her wicked stepmother to her own flesh and blood. We cannot crawl inside Diana's head to settle the matter, and the spite-driven interpretation remains contested rather than proven. Still, the timing resists innocence. The alliance carried at least a whiff of calculated cruelty toward an absent mother. Whatever its true motive, the friendship handed Reine a strange vindication in the public eye, and it coincided with the final, surprising act of her professional life. In 1996, the businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed, then owner of Harrods, appointed Reine, a director of Harrods International, handing a woman in her late 60s a serious corporate post. She declined to treat it as a sinecure. She worked vigorously, managing relationships across international markets and applying the same drive she once spent on town councils and crumbling roofs. Colleagues who braced for a decorative figurehead met instead a sharp, demanding director who read her briefs and recalled her figures. Al-Fayed, no easy man to please, kept her on. The supposed idle parasite, in her 7th decade, reported for duty and earned her keep. The friendship outlasted the marriage that first threw both women together, but it did not outlast Diana herself. On the 31st of August, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, killed alongside Dodi Fayed, the son of Rain's own employer at Harrods. The woman Rain reconciled with so improbably vanished at 36, and the strange late alliance closed almost as abruptly as it began. Whatever its motives, the bond ended in a Paris underpass. Rain kept working, kept entertaining, and kept her facade immaculate almost to the end, the Cartland lessons holding firm through every reversal a single life can absorb. On the 21st of October, 2016, she died of cancer at the age of 87, and her body found rest in North Sheen Cemetery in southwest London, far from the grand crypts of the family that threw her out. The obituaries split predictably along the old fault line. Some writers recalled Acid Rain, the gold-digging, wicked stepmother of legend, while others, looking harder, named the politician, the preservationist, and the woman who saved a house. A quiet poetry attends where she came to rest. The grand Spencer dead lie at Great Brington, near Althorpe, in the vault their ancestors filled across the centuries, and Diana herself lies on the island at Althorpe that Charles turned into her shrine. Rain lies in neither place. She rests in North Sheen Cemetery in suburban southwest London, a public burial ground far removed from the ancestral grandeur she defended and rescued, parted in death from the family that cast her out in life. The woman who fought so hard to belong among them did not, in the end, lie among them. Even her grave records the verdict the Spencers passed. The case against her holds real weight. Rain could turn imperious, thin-skinned, and overwhelming, armoured in a social ambition she inherited whole from her mother and never once apologised for. Her taste at Althorpe struck the aristocracy as garish, and she liquidated centuries of accumulated Spencer heritage with a cold pragmatism that wounded her stepchildren even where it rescued their inheritance. People who found her unbearable did not invent the quality from nothing. She handed them ample material. In the years since her death, a slow reassessment chips at the legend. Obituaries and historians, freed at last from the heat of the Diana years, weigh the politician and the rescuer against the caricature, and the balance tilts far less lopsided than the tabloids ever allowed. Time treats her more kindly than her stepchildren did. The grandchildren of her fiercest critics now wander the streets and galleries, her stubbornness pulled back from the wrecking ball. The Covent Garden she saved still hums with crowds. The National Portrait Gallery she defended still hangs its pictures, and Althorpe still stands on the foundations she paid to secure. A woman remembered for one cruel nickname left behind a string of London landmarks that outlasted nearly everyone who mocked her. The villain of the fairy tale, in the end, outclassed everyone else in the room. Rain McCorquodale arrived with no inherited rank, climbed by sheer will into the upper reaches of a class designed to shut her out, rescued one of its monuments with her own money, nursed its dying lord back toward life, and left through the door in rubbish bags for her trouble. Her stepchildren still live in the house she saved. They keep her name out of the family story and her grave miles from their own, yet the house keeps standing on her money all the same. There's a word the British upper class used to throw around in the 20th century, a word so loaded with judgment it could end a woman's social life in a single syllable. Bolter, what it meant was simple and cruel. A woman who walked out on her marriage, her children, her entire aristocratic existence for another man. Once that label got stuck on you, good luck peeling it off for the rest of your natural life. You were finished at every country house weekend, from Cornwall to Caithness, cut from every guest list that mattered. In 1967, a 1-year-old mother of 4 got branded with that word, and the British tabloids spent the next 3 decades treating her like she'd committed some kind of unforgivable sin against British decency. Her name was Frances Shand Kidd. Here's what nobody wants to admit about that woman. The so-called Bolter raised the most famous human being of the late 20th century, buried an infant son who lived 10 hours, lost her other children in a courtroom where her own mother testified against her, watched her daughter become a princess, then watched that daughter die in a Paris tunnel while the two of them weren't speaking. In her late 50s, she converted to Catholicism. Her final years were spent pushing wheelchairs through the grotto at Lourdes. So yeah, Bolter seems a little reductive. I'm going to tell you the story of Diana's mother today. Not Princess Diana, her mom, a Norfolk-born aristocrat who got married off at 18, lost almost everything she loved by 35, and somehow clawed out a life on a windswept Scottish island where she sold trinkets to tourists and drove way too fast on country roads. Frances Ruth Burke Roche, the woman history tried to flatten into a footnote. On January 20th of 1936, Frances Ruth Burke Roche was born at Park House, a big Victorian pile on the Sandringham estate. And I mean on the Sandringham estate. Like a few minutes' walk from where the King of England actually lived. Park House had been leased to her parents by King George V himself, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about where this baby ranked in the British pecking order. Born into the royal orbit, literally. Her dad, Maurice Roche, was the 4th Baron Fermoy, Conservative MP, Irish barony, the whole aristocratic package. Ruth Gill, her mum, played piano beautifully and possessed the kind of steel spine that would one day, decades later, lead her to testify against her own daughter in a custody battle. We'll get to that. Foreshadowing. The Roche family goes way back. Irish Catholic aristocracy in County Cork, centuries deep, with the Fermoy barony kicking around since 1856. But the more interesting part of Frances's bloodline came from the other side of the Atlantic, because her great-grandmother was an American heiress named Frances Ellen Work. Frank Work, a New York stockbroker and the heiress's father, did not like the British, at all. His suspicion of European aristocrats marrying his money ran so deep that he wrote it into his will. Any descendant who accepted a British title forfeited their inheritance. Full stop, no negotiation. Spoiler alert, they took the title anyway. Maurice Roche briefly renounced his British connections to grab the American cash, then later quietly reclaimed the Fermoy barony when the dust settled. Classic have your cake and eat it too aristocratic maneuvering. You got to admire the audacity. So that's the family situation. Irish title, American money, a house on the royal estate, and a mum who was tight with the royals themselves. Ruth Fermoy would go on to serve as a confidant and woman of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, from 1956 until her death in 1993. 37 years of whispering in the ear of the royal matriarch. Frances grew up playing with the future Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, because that's what you did when you lived at Park House. The royal kids would come over, or you'd go over there, and the proximity was casual and constant. An older sister named Mary and a younger brother, Edmund, who would eventually inherit the Fermoy title, rounded out the family. But let's be honest about who mattered in that nursery. The kids who actually counted were the ones down the road at the big house. Frances's childhood was standard-issue British upper crust. Ponies, nannies, governesses, and eventually boarding school. Downham School in Hatfield Heath, Essex, was basically a finishing institution for girls of her class, full of deportment lessons and French conjugations, and not a lot of, actual education in the modern sense. Then came Paris, finishing school in the French capital, because what's the point of being a baron's daughter if you can't order dessert in fluent Parisian? By the time she came home, she was 17, tall, blonde, strikingly pretty, and ready for the part of her life that would determine everything else. The 1953 London season. Okay. Quick context for anyone unfamiliar. The season was this bizarre, almost feudal ritual where debutantes from aristocratic families were formally presented at court and then paraded through a series of balls and house parties for several months, with the unstated but crystal-clear purpose of husband acquisition. Think of it as in-person Tinder for the hereditary ruling class, except everyone is wearing gloves and your mother is watching. 1953 was a particularly big deal. It was also the coronation year of Queen Elizabeth II, and Frances got presented at court during the most high-profile season in a generation, which meant photographers, newspaper columns, breathless gossip about who might marry whom. Into that circus walked a 30-year-old man named Edward John Spencer. Viscount Althorp, heir to the Earldom of Spencer, one of the most eligible bachelors in Britain. Johnny Spencer, as everyone called him, came from a family so old and so grand that it made the Roches look like new money. The Spencers had been Spencers for roughly forever, sitting on enormous estates and mountains of silverware, and Johnny himself had served as an equerry to King George VI and then to the young Queen Elizabeth II. There'd been a brief engagement to Lady Anne Coke before that fell apart. Now he was looking. Frances looked back. Their engagement happened fast. She was 18. 12 years separated them, with Johnny being 30. And in the context of 1950s Britain, this was mildly eyebrow-raising, but not scandalous, because aristocratic marriages tilted this way all the time. On June 1, 1954, Westminster Abbey. Yeah, you heard that right. Westminster Abbey, the place where monarchs get crowned and buried, was where they got married. Queen Elizabeth II attended. Prince Philip too, obviously, along with the Queen Mother, because Ruth Fermoy was her best friend in the world. Every major player in the British aristocracy showed up, and the newspapers called it the Society Wedding of the Year, and for once the newspapers weren't exaggerating. Picture an 8-year-old girl walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey while the Queen watches from the pews. That's the starting line for Frances's adult life. As Viscountess Althorp, she moved into the Spencer family properties and got to work doing what 1950s aristocratic wives were expected to do, which was to produce children, preferably male children, preferably right now. Frances delivered her first child on February 19, 1955, a girl, Sarah. A good start. Girls were fine, but the expectation was always crystal clear. because the family needed an heir, a boy, and the title, and the estate at Althorpe and the whole dynastic apparatus required male continuation. Cynthia Jane arrived February 11, 1957. Another girl, lovely, healthy, also fatally in aristocratic terms, not an heir. Now the pressure intensified. In aristocratic families of this vintage, a woman who produced only daughters was quietly considered to be failing at her primary job. Not officially, nobody would say it to her face, but it was there, in the silences and the pointed questions and the Harley Street specialists her husband would soon be booking appointments with. On January 12, 1960, a son, John. He was named after his father. The child lived 10 hours. Medical records from the time are vague, and the family kept the details fiercely private. What we know is that the baby was born with severe complications and died within the span of a workday, and Frances never held her son conscious. She woke up from anesthesia to the news. And what Johnny Spencer did next tells you everything about the marriage Francis was in. Processing his own grief in his own way, he concluded that the problem was his wife, that something was wrong with her, that her body was defective in some way, and so he sent her to Harley Street, the famous London medical street, where the wealthy get poked and prodded by the country's top specialists to undergo evaluations to determine why she hadn't produced a healthy male heir. His wife had just lost a son, and his response was to have her medically investigated like a broken piece of livestock. Who I feel worse for is genuinely a tough call. Frances being treated like a reproductive malfunction is the obvious answer. But honestly, Johnny, so encased in the expectations of his class that he couldn't see what he was doing, is also kind of tragic in his own way. Probably Frances, though. Let's be honest. It's Frances. She went through the tests, endured the humiliation. On July 1, 1961, she gave birth to another daughter. Her name was Diana. Diana Frances Spencer arrived in this world as what her parents considered another failure, a consolation prize, another girl when they needed a boy, and Frances would later reflect on how awful it was to see her newborn daughter greeted with such open disappointment in the delivery room. The most famous woman of the late 20th century, the princess whose face sold more magazines than anyone in history, was born into a room where her arrival was mourned as a setback. Finally, on May 20, 1964, Frances delivered the longed-for son, Charles Edward Maurice Spencer, the heir, the future 9th Earl Spencer, the guy who would one day write a memoir that would recontextualize every single thing you're about to hear. But by 1964, something had already broken in her. The marriage, the miscarriages, the treatment, the grief, all of it had taken a toll she couldn't keep hiding. She was still in her 22nd, and she was done. Her father, Maurice Roche, died in 1955, and this created an opportunity because the lease on Park House, Frances's childhood home on the Sandringham estate, was passed to the Spencers. So Frances, now Viscountess Althorpe, moved back into the house she'd been born in. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Park House became the scene of her marriage's slow-motion disintegration. The kids were raised there. Diana's earliest memories were of Park House. Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles running around those Norfolk lawns, playing with royal cousins next door, living what looked from the outside like a genuinely charmed childhood. From the inside, different story entirely. Their parents were increasingly unhappy, increasingly distant, increasingly bitter. with the bitterness leaking into every room of the house by the mid-1960s. And here's where I have to pause and tell you something important. The accounts of what went on inside that marriage are contested, and the most explosive claims came out in 2024, when Charles Spencer published a memoir called A Very Private School. In that book, he alleged that he had witnessed his father physically abuse his mother, framing her eventual departure as an act of self-preservation, not abandonment. Johnny Spencer died in 1992. The guy can't defend himself. These allegations come from a son who was very young at the time of the events he describes. A son who has his own complicated feelings about his father. A son who also suffered horrific abuse at a boarding school his father sent him to. Charles's memoir is one man's account of his own family, and it deserves serious weight, but it's also not a court record or an independently verified investigation. So, I'm going to tell you what Charles Spencer has publicly claimed, and you can weigh it however you want to weigh it. The upshot, however you slice it, is that by the mid-1960s, Frances was miserable in that marriage. It's 1966. Peter Shand Kidd was Australian-born, heir to a successful British wallpaper business. And I know wallpaper sounds like a joke punchline, but it's genuinely where the family fortune came from, and you can make a lot of money in wallpaper if you're in the right spot at the right time, which the Shand Kidds were. He was 41, married, with 3 kids of his own, and by every account, the guy was fun. Warm, relaxed. The opposite of Johnny Spencer's stiff upper lip don't feel anything aristocratic energy. Peter laughed, drank, told stories, listened when women actually spoke. Frances fell for him. Their affair began sometime in 1966, and for the first few months they kept it quiet, or quietish, because high society London in the 1960s was basically a village where everyone knew everyone's business within 48 hours. Rumors circulated, as they always did. Nobody said anything out loud. Then, in late 1967, Frances did the thing aristocratic women weren't supposed to do. She left. Packing up the 2 youngest children, Diana and Charles, she moved to a house in Belgravia, London, with the idea in her own mind being that this would be a trial separation, a way to sort things out, with the kids going back to boarding school and her figuring out the next move. Johnny Spencer had other ideas. Christmas 1967 came and went. The children went to Park House for the holidays to see their father, and then, when Christmas was over, Johnny refused to send them back, just flat refused, packed their trunks back up for school when term started, and left Frances standing in London with no kids and no legal standing whatsoever. He'd lawyered up, filed for custody, and the custody battle was on. Okay, I need to prepare you for what's coming, because this part of Frances's story is brutal in a way that's hard to overstate. British wardship proceedings in the 1960s were sealed, and largely still are, so we don't have a public transcript of what happened in that courtroom. What we have are second-hand accounts from biographers and family members that have leaked out over the decades, and those accounts are not pretty. Here's the outline. Frances expected to win custody because in her mind the case was obvious. She was the mother, the children were young, and she was the primary caregiver, which in most modern divorces is a slam dunk. But 1968 Britain was not modern Britain. The legal system of the time was more than willing to punish a woman who had left her marriage, especially for another man. Adultery carried serious weight in family court. Character witnesses mattered enormously. The court wanted to hear from people who knew the family intimately. Among the people called to provide evidence was Francis's own mother. Lady Ruth Fermoy, devoted servant of the Queen Mother, keeper of aristocratic propriety, stepped up for her son-in-law. The exact nature of her intervention has been debated by biographers for decades, but the outcome isn't in dispute. She sided with Johnny against her own daughter. Think about what that does to a person. You're fighting to keep your children. You're in a courtroom trying to prove you're fit to raise them, and the woman who gave birth to you walks in and tells the judge you're not. Frances lost. All 4 children went to Johnny, with her limited visitation as the only leftover thread. The divorce was finalized in April 1969. She was 33 years old, and the British press absolutely savaged her. Over and over and over, the word the papers used was bolter. A woman who had abandoned her children for another man, a cautionary tale, a character flaw, dressed up as a news story. Aristocratic mothers whispered about her at dinner parties. Guest lists pruned her out one by one. Ruth Fermoy, her own mother, stopped speaking to her for years. Meanwhile, her children were growing up at Park House. And then, after Johnny inherited the earldom in 1975, at Althorpe itself, nannies raised them, boarding schools raised them. A grieving father, whatever else you want to say about him, raised them in his own distant way. Diana, in particular, never fully got over the loss of her mother. She told Andrew Morton in the famous biographical tapes that she remembered crying herself to sleep at Park House, listening to her brother call out for a mum who wasn't there. The crunch of her mother's car on the gravel the night she left stayed with her forever. Diana's ambivalence about Frances would shape their entire relationship for the rest of both their lives. Love tangled up with resentment, tangled up with longing, tangled up with anger. On May 2, 1969, Frances married Peter Shand Kidd. Her second wedding was nothing like the first. No Westminster Abbey, no Queen in the front row. Small, private, deliberately low-key, because after what she'd been through, she wanted to disappear. A farmhouse on the Isle of Skye became their home. A small island off the west coast of Scotland, connected to the mainland by a single stone bridge. Skye is beautiful in that particular Scottish way, where beautiful means cold, wet, and devastatingly isolated from anything resembling London society. The island's population is a few hundred people. The nearest town of any size is Oban, about half an hour's drive away on winding single-track roads. Frances loved it. Fishing for salmon became one of her great passions, and by every account she got seriously good at it, which is way harder than it sounds and requires an almost monastic patience. She walked the moors for hours. She drank in the local pub with farmers. Her friendships with the local fishermen and shopkeepers grew deep precisely because those people had absolutely no idea or interest in her aristocratic background. For the first time in her life, Frances was just Frances. A gift shop in Oban became her next project, selling tweed scarves and shortbread and little woolen sheep and the usual Scottish tourist fare. She ran it herself, stood behind the counter, chatted with tourists who had no clue they were being rung up by the mother of the future Princess of Wales. This, I think, is the Frances worth spending time with. Not the woman in the Westminster Abbey photos. The woman in a fisherman's sweater, hair a mess, counting the till at a tourist shop in the Scottish Highlands while the wind hammered the harbour outside. Her marriage to Peter was happy for about 15 years. They had a life together that nobody in her old London circles would have recognised, but it was hers, and that mattered more than recognition. Her children visited when they could. Diana, in particular, would make the trip up to Scotland when she was a teenager, and those visits became precious to Frances, who tried her best to rebuild a relationship with her daughters that had been severed in that 1968 courtroom. Slow-going, awkward at times, at least it was real. Then in the late 1970s, something happened that pulled Frances back into the world she had spent a decade trying to escape. Diana started dating the Prince of Wales. On November 1977, Diana, 16 years old, met Prince Charles at a shoot at Althorpe, where Charles was dating Diana's older sister Sarah at the time. You cannot make this up. Aristocratic dating pools were genuinely that small. By 1980, Charles and Diana were an item. On February 1981, they were engaged. Frances, tucked away on her Scottish island and minding her own business, got sucked back into the spotlight, whether she wanted it or not. On July 29, 1981, the royal wedding happened at St. Paul's Cathedral. 750 million viewers worldwide, one of the most watched events in human history. Frances attended, of course, watching her daughter become the Princess of Wales. But the seating arrangements were a logistical nightmare because she and Johnny had been divorced for over a decade and couldn't be anywhere near each other. The organisers split Diana's mother and father onto opposite sides of the cathedral. Johnny walked Diana down the aisle, having suffered a severe stroke in 1978 that left his health fragile, but he made it through the ceremony on sheer willpower. Frances watched from her seat. Her first grandchild, Prince William, would be born less than a year later. Throughout the entire 1980s, Frances occupied a strange position as the mother of the most photographed woman alive, but also a divorced aristocrat who had been publicly humiliated 20 years earlier and had deliberately chosen a life away from cameras. Interviews? She didn't do them. Quotes? She didn't give them. From Scotland, she watched. Diana's marriage, meanwhile, was doing exactly what Frances's had done, which was falling apart in slow motion. By the late 1980s, the whispers about Charles and Camilla were everywhere, along with Diana's bulimia and her depression and her unhappiness and her isolation, all of it echoing patterns Frances herself had lived through a generation earlier. You'd think this would bring them closer. Sometimes it did. Frances was genuinely supportive during the worst years of Diana's marriage, but here's the thing about Frances as a mother. She was not, by temperament, a warm and nurturing type. Diana needed someone to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. Frances was better at telling her to buck up and go for a long walk. Both types of mothers have their virtues, but they weren't always the mother Diana needed, and Diana sometimes said so, loudly. Meanwhile, back on the Isle of Skye, the Shand Kidd marriage was cracking up, and nobody ever got a clear public explanation of what went wrong between Frances and Peter. What we know is that by 1988, Peter had moved out and eventually married another woman, Marie-Pierre Palmer. Their divorce was finalized in 1990. Frances, at 54, was divorced for the second time. Here's where her life could easily have spiraled. Alone, twice divorced, estranged periodically from her now famous daughter, living on an isolated Scottish island with nobody to fish with anymore. Instead, Frances did something nobody saw coming. In 1994, Frances officially converted to Roman Catholicism. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a religious conversion, not that big a deal. But for a woman of her background, raised Church of England, closely tied to the British royal family, this was a bigger move than it sounds. The British royals had spent 450 years being professionally not Catholic. Ruth Fermoy, Frances's own mother, was a pillar of Anglican propriety who had spent 4 decades at the Queen Mother's side. Converting to Catholicism was Frances quietly telling her old world to get lost. She took it seriously. Her Catholicism then channeled into a specific charity that became the center of her later life. The HCPT, the Pilgrimage Trust, is a British Catholic charity that organises pilgrimages to Lourdes for sick and disabled children. Every year, volunteers take thousands of kids to the French shrine town where a 4-year-old girl named Bernadette claimed in 1858 to have seen the Virgin Mary, and the grotto there became a place of pilgrimage for the sick who go hoping for healing. Frances threw herself into HCPT with the kind of energy she'd once spent on salmon fishing. Year after year she went to Lourdes, even as her own health started to decline, pushing the wheelchairs of disabled children through the narrow streets of the town. Every single volunteer who worked with her in those years tells the same story. She refused special treatment. Frances Shand Kidd, née Roche, debutante of 1953, mother of the Princess of Wales, in a rain slicker, pushing a kid in a wheelchair through a French town because she believed it mattered. I don't know what you believe about any of this religiously, but as character development, not too shabby. All right, let's pump the brakes and acknowledge that Frances was not a saint, because she wasn't. And she'd probably be the first person to tell you so. A complicated woman with complicated habits, one of which was driving way too fast on Scottish country roads while under the influence. In 1996, she pleaded guilty to drink driving in Scotland, earned a 4-month driving ban, and paid a substantial fine. Her incident became a national news story because of who she was, which she hated bitterly. For a woman who had spent decades trying to stay out of the papers, having her name splashed across every front page because she'd blown over the limit was a humiliation she genuinely didn't deserve, but she'd brought it on herself, and she knew it. She took the punishment without complaint, served out her ban by getting friends to drive her around the island, and paid the fine in full. Local Oban court officials reportedly said she was one of the more well-behaved celebrity defendants they'd dealt with, which, frankly, is not a high bar when you consider the field. Diana's marriage to Prince Charles had been officially over since August 1996, and the divorce settlement had stripped her of the HRH style, meaning she was no longer technically Her Royal Highness, just Diana, Princess of Wales. A demotion, in royal protocol terms, that generated enormous tabloid noise on both sides of the Atlantic. Frances, now 61, gave an interview to Hello magazine on the topic of her daughter's divorce, and in that interview she said something that I think she genuinely believed was supportive, but which Diana experienced as a knife in the back. Her mother told the magazine she thought it was absolutely wonderful that Diana had lost the HRH, framing the loss as liberating, arguing that now her daughter could find her own identity. Now she could stop being defined by the royal family. Now she could just be Diana. From Frances's own perspective, this was a reasonable thing to say, because she herself had spent her life trying to escape the constraints of aristocratic identity, and she saw the loss of the title as an opportunity rather than a wound. Diana did not see it that way. She felt publicly demeaned by her own mother, and she reacted the way she often reacted when she felt betrayed, which was to cut off contact completely. Their phone calls that spring and summer got worse. The mother-daughter relationship, which had already been fragile since 1968, for reasons you now understand, finally shattered. Then came August 31, 1997. I don't need to tell you this part of the story, Everyone knows this part. Princess Diana died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris in the early hours of August 31, 1997, at 36 years old. Francis and Diana had not spoken in months. The two of them had not spoken in months, and they would never speak again, because somebody had to call Francis on Sile Island in the middle of the night and tell her that her daughter was dead, and that the last conversation they'd had was a fight. I cannot imagine what that phone call was like. I genuinely don't want to try. Charles Spencer, Francis's son, would later give the eulogy at Diana's funeral at Westminster Abbey, the same cathedral where his mother had been married 43 years earlier. Francis attended. Stone-faced, British, stoic to the end, because that's what her generation did at funerals for daughters. Her relationship with William and Harry continued quietly in the years after. Occasional visits at Eton or Highgrove, private conversations that never made the papers because she refused to talk about them. Of all the things she managed to protect from the tabloids, her grandsons topped the list. But the years after Diana's death were hard, because Francis was dealing with the loss, with her estrangement, with the public autopsy of Diana's life that went on and on and on and on for what felt like the rest of the decade. On October 2002, Francis, now 66, got called to testify at the theft trial of Paul Burrell, Diana's former butler. Burrell stood accused of stealing items from Diana's estate. The trial became a tabloid circus in which every detail of Diana's private life got dragged back into public view, and Francis had to take the stand. Under cross-examination, she was forced to discuss the breakdown of her relationship with Diana, confirming under oath that they had not spoken for months before Diana's death, responding to claims from aides that she had been verbally abusive on the phone during those final conversations, claims she vehemently denied, but which were now part of the court record. The damage was done regardless of what she said. The whole painful last chapter of her relationship with her daughter was back on the front page. The trial itself collapsed in November 2002, when the Queen suddenly recalled a conversation that exonerated Burrell. An absolute farce of an ending to a case that should never have been brought in the first place. But Francis had already been put through the ringer, and there was no putting that back. Francis was sick for longer than the public knew. Parkinson's disease came first. Then, sometime in the early 2000s, she was diagnosed with a brain tumour. She continued to live at her home in Callanish on the Isle of Sile, continued for as long as she could to participate in parish life at the Catholic Church in Oban, and continued to refuse interview requests from every newspaper in Britain. On June 3, 2004, Frances Shand Kidd died at home. She was 68. Her funeral was held on June the 1st at the Cathedral Church of St. Columba in Oban, a grey stone building overlooking the harbour where she'd run her shop for so many years. Princes William and Harry attended. Charles Spencer came with his sisters Sarah and Jane. Prince Charles, notably, did not come. Francis was buried at Pennyfuir Cemetery on the outskirts of Oban. If you go there today, her grave is simple. A stone, a name, dates. That's it. No Westminster Abbey funeral for her, no royal carriage, just a Scottish burial in the town where she'd run her gift shop for 30 years, attended by the neighbours and family members who had actually known her rather than the avatar the tabloids had constructed. It's the funeral she would have wanted. It's the funeral she got. Okay, let me try to answer the hard question. Who was Frances Shand Kidd? The tabloid version said she was a bolter, a woman who walked out on 4 kids for a wallpaper heir. a selfish aristocrat who got what was coming to her. The revisionist version, which has gained ground, especially since Charles Spencer's 2024 memoir, casts her as a survivor, a woman fleeing an abusive marriage, a victim of a patriarchal legal system that punished her for leaving. Both of these versions have truth in them. Neither of them is the whole story. The Frances I come away with, after reading everything I could find about her, is more layered than either of those takes allow. She was, first and foremost, an ordinary woman born into extraordinary circumstances, which is actually the opposite of the usual biographical frame, where we say the subject is an extraordinary person in ordinary circumstances. Frances was not a genius, not a world historical figure, just a reasonably smart, reasonably athletic, reasonably good-looking British girl who happened to be born at Park House instead of in a terraced house in Newcastle. That accident of birth put her on a track she did not choose and could not really escape until she finally forced the issue at 31. She made bad decisions. Marrying at 18 was a bad decision. Having an affair while married was an ethically ambiguous one. The Hello interview in 1997 was tone-deaf and hurt her daughter badly. Her drink driving in 1996 was dangerous and wrong. She was capable of being cold, and her children, especially Diana, sometimes experienced her as emotionally unavailable in ways that left marks. But she also had real courage. Leaving Johnny Spencer in 1967 took nerve, whatever the exact trigger was. Living through the custody loss without completely falling apart took nerve. Rebuilding her life in Scotland took nerve. Converting to Catholicism at 58 and spending her remaining years pushing wheelchairs through Lourdes took a kind of quiet, moral seriousness that you don't usually find in fallen debutantes. And she had enormous, unglamorous dignity. No tell-all memoir, no paid interviews, no cashing in on being Diana's mother when she could have made millions doing so. Year after year, when the chance came to become a tabloid fixture, she went back to her island and ran her shop. The phrase that keeps coming back to me, reading her own words, is something she said in one of her rare interviews. "I am not a recluse. I just like my own company." That's maybe the closest thing to a self-description Frances ever gave. After everything the press did to her, after everything the aristocracy did to her, after everything the courts and her own mother and her first husband and her second husband and her most famous daughter did to her, she just wanted to be left alone with her salmon rod and her rosary and her Scottish weather. I told you at the start that the British upper class used to throw around the word bolter like it settled the question of a woman's worth. It didn't. Frances Shand Kidd was a complicated woman, not a saint, not a victim, not a villain, just a human being who lived through an amount of loss that would break most people and who kept going anyway. Mostly quietly, mostly on her own terms, mostly in a place where the press couldn't reach her. She raised, partly at a distance, the most famous woman of the late 20th century. Buried a son who lived 10 hours, lost 3 more children to a sealed courtroom in 1968, outlived her second daughter in the worst possible way a parent can. Died of 2 diseases at once in a stone house on a Scottish island in 2004. Through all of it, she found a gift shop in Oban and a grotto at Lourdes and a salmon river in the Highlands and a faith she had not been born into, and she built a life on the rubble of the one that was taken from her. Her grandsons, William and Harry, still speak warmly about their grandmother on the rare occasions they mention her at all, which isn't often, because the family learned long ago not to feed the tabloid machine. William is now the Prince of Wales, holding the title Diana held, a title that in some chain of cosmic bureaucracy Francis's great-great-grandfather Frank Work would have absolutely hated. Frances would have thought that was funny, I think. Her sense of humour was dry, the kind that comes from watching your own life get misreported in the papers for 50 straight years. There's one detail I want to leave you with, because it keeps sticking with me. When Frances was dying, in the last months of her life, she was too sick to travel to Lourdes anymore. A decade of annual pilgrimages, pushing the wheelchairs and singing the songs and believing whatever she believed about the water and the grotto and the Virgin Mary. And then, in 2004, she couldn't make the trip. So her friends from HCPT, the volunteers she had worked alongside for years, sent her a little container of water from Lourdes. They brought it all the way back to Sile Island, gave it to her at home. She kept it by her bed until she died. A woman who had finally found something to hold on to after a lifetime of losing things, and who held on to it all the way to the grave at Penyfuir. Thanks for watching this one. It took me longer than usual to research because the sources on Frances are scattered and contradictory, and many of the people who knew her best are no longer around to ask. If I got something wrong, or if you have a family story or a local memory of Frances from the Oban years, drop it in the comments. I read them. Full list on screen. Let me know down below. See you in the next one.